One night in 2020, a woman named Beth Van Oss paced back and forth in a small room in the house she shared with her boyfriend, Mike, in rural Colorado. She dialed Mike's phone number again and put her phone to her ear, but just like the last one, in Dinosaur National Monument, a huge park that stretches out over 200,000 acres on the Colorado-Utah border. Mike glanced over and saw his good friend and poker buddy, Stephen Inlow, on a snowmobile of his own. And Mike could see Stephen had a big smile on his face. He knew his friend was taking in the stunning scenery all around them. They were cruising across a snow-covered field, there were forests on either side, and the hills and mountains and mesas all rising up in the distance. Now, normally, that's what Mike would be doing too. He loved the outdoors, and this place was absolutely beautiful. However, unlike Stephen, Mike had not come to Dinosaur National Monument to enjoy the views. He'd come here to fulfill a quest he'd been on for years. Mike looked away from Stephen and focused his attention back on the ground in front of him and the speed of his snowmobile. He didn't want to make any mistakes, because the last time Mike had come out here, just a few weeks earlier, he'd gotten stuck in the snow, and the Park Service had come to rescue him. At the time, the officers had warned him not to come to this spot again. There was no cell service, and it was very easy to get lost. However, Mike clearly had no intention of heeding that warning. After all, he knew something that the Park Service did not. He knew that hidden in the wilds of Dinosaur National Monument, there was a treasure that would change his life, and more importantly, the life of the woman he loved, forever. That woman was his longtime girlfriend, Beth Van Oss. And for several years, in addition to being her romantic partner, Mike had also been Beth's caregiver, because she had suffered a brain injury. Mike cooked all her meals, he took her to the doctor, and did basically whatever she needed. But at the same time, he had always felt tortured by the fact that he couldn't just take away her suffering altogether. Now, over time, Beth had begun to feel better, but both of them were still trying to recover from the whole ordeal. And the treasure that Mike was searching for was like the final step in their recovery. It would guarantee that both Mike and Beth would have happy, comfortable lives from here on out. However, only Mike believed this treasure existed. Beth didn't. Instead, Beth really was just concerned about Mike's safety while he was out pursuing this quest. She felt like it was kind of pointless and he was going to get hurt. But Mike was sure of himself, he knew, the risk was worth it, and also he just wasn't scared. For this trip in particular, he knew he had brought Stephen along, so he wasn't alone. Now, Mike knew Stephen didn't believe in the quest any more than Beth did, but Stephen was a great friend and travel companion. And another reason why Mike wasn't that concerned about his safety is he had spent years studying and preparing for this journey, and he knew he was ready. So, he squeezed the throttle and felt his snowmobile kick into high speed. About 20 minutes later, Mike and Stephen steered their snowmobiles around a curve, and up ahead, Mike saw some of the geographical landmarks he'd been waiting for: a snowy field, a dry rocky path, and a hill rising up against the sky. So he slowed his snowmobile down and brought it to a stop, and Stephen did the same thing. Then Mike took his backpack off, opened it up, and took out a book. This book, in Mike's mind, was the key to the success of his quest. But Mike knew, not everyone close to him felt the same way about this book, or about Mike's obsession with this book. Beth and others worried that this book could actually lead Mike and whoever he brought with him into danger. But Mike had no intention of giving up when he was this close. So Mike opened up the book, and like he had so many times before, he read a few lines from the front. They went like this: "Begin it where warm waters halt, and take it in the canyon down. Not far, but too far to walk. Put in below the home of Brown." Beth would always say it sounded like this stuff was written by a madman. Mike didn't disagree that the writing was strange at times, but at the same time, he really felt like the writing contained the information he was desperately seeking. While keeping the book open, Mike also pulled out a map he'd brought, and he began to look from the map to the hill out in front of him, and then back to this poem in the book. And as he did this a few times, he felt this rush of happiness, because he was sure that everything he'd been working towards was about to come to fruition. He looked over and told Stephen they were definitely on the right path. But since the snow-covered field they'd ridden across gave way to a dry rocky trail ahead, they would have to walk the rest of the way. Stephen nodded agreeably, and then both men climbed off their snowmobiles. Mike took out a couple of candy bars and a jug of water from his backpack, and he tossed one of the bars to Stephen, and the two friends just stood there and ate and passed the jug of water back and forth. When they were done, Mike put the jug, the map, and his book back in his backpack. Then he and Stephen left their snowmobiles parked where they were and headed on foot down the rocky path. So both Mike and Stephen spent a lot of time outdoors, and so this felt like a pretty easy hike. The altitude wasn't too high, and it wasn't too cold. It was in the upper 30s, but not frigid. It was basically a perfect early spring day in Colorado for a hike. Soon, the friends headed up an incline towards a ridge at the top of the path, and as they did, Mike felt a rush. The ridge had a spectacular view, and he knew that from the top of it, he should be able to finally see their destination. And so he told Stephen to hold on a second, and then he pulled off his backpack and pulled out his book again and flipped it open. Mike read a few more lines that sounded like this. "If you've been wise and found the blaze, look quickly down, your quest to cease." Mike picked up his pace, eager to look down. However, when he got to the top of the ridge, the rush he'd been feeling disappeared. So he fumbled for his map and opened it up, and as he stared at it, he began to frown. Stephen asked him if everything was okay, and Mike tried to figure out how to answer. According to the route they were on, which Mike had planned using the book, there was a specific hill that was supposed to be much closer at this point in the hike. But now, standing on the top of this ridge and looking out, the spot they were headed to looked like it was miles away. But Mike took a steadying breath, calmed himself down, and told Stephen that everything was fine. Then he put the map away and continued to survey the land out in front of them. From the ridge, their path dipped down and then slowly climbed back up to a higher elevation until it reached another ridge. And so Mike told Stephen that once they got through this next part of the hike and got to that other ridge, then they would be within striking distance of that hill. Mike could see that Stephen didn't look too worried. So Mike just handed him another candy bar, took a swig from the water bottle, and then led the way down this new part of the path. And within a few minutes, Mike started feeling excited again. He'd come this far. All he had to do now was just be patient a little while longer. By the time the friends hit the next ridge, the sun had begun to set. Mike didn't know how much time had passed, but now, surveying out from this ridgeline, he was starting to feel worried. Because this hill they were heading towards still did not look any closer. He could feel his legs starting to ache, and he was getting tired. He looked over at Stephen, and even though Stephen didn't say anything, Mike could tell he was getting pretty worn down too. Mike pulled the map out of his backpack again, but it felt futile. He had thought he knew exactly what he was doing, but clearly this was a much further journey than he'd realized. And when Mike put the map in his backpack and looked inside of it, he suddenly felt this pit in his stomach. When they'd left on their snowmobiles earlier that day, Mike had thought this trip would only take a few hours. And because of that, he and Stephen had decided to travel very light. No tent, no fire starting materials, and barely any food. And so now, looking inside of his backpack, Mike saw that they'd already gone through the few candy bars and all the water they had brought. All he had left was the book. At this point, Mike felt mad at himself. He told Stephen that he must have just really badly miscalculated, because obviously they were not anywhere closer to reaching this hill. And now that it was getting dark and cold out, and they had no food or supplies, Mike didn't see any other option but to abandon the quest. And so Mike turned away from the view of the hill off in the distance that he now knew he was not going to reach. Maybe he'd been wrong this whole time. Maybe this book really was totally dangerous and written by an actual madman and, didn't contain the secrets that Mike was sure it must. Maybe he really had dragged his friend Stephen out here on a fool's errand. But Mike knew he couldn't spend any time worrying about any of that. Instead, he needed to figure out what they were going to do. It was getting late, and he and Stephen were now miles away from their snowmobiles. Without saying much, the two men packed up their stuff, promptly turned around, and began the hike back. However, pretty quickly, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the temperature felt like it dropped immediately. The men had only worn hoodies and light jackets because they had dressed for a pleasant day with temperatures in the upper 30s. But now the wind and the cold just cut through their clothes. The two men sped up, hoping that by moving quickly that would kind of warm them up, but the wind was quickly going from just being strong to being this howling storm-level wind. Eventually, Mike shouted to Steven that there was just no way they could make it back in this weather, and so he pulled his phone out of his pocket, hoping maybe he could call 911, but when he tried to dial, nothing happened. His phone had no service. And so Steven took out his phone and he tried, but he also didn't have service. And so with the wind howling all around them, they tried to get to higher ground to see if maybe that would make a difference, but their phones still didn't work. And by now, Mike and Steven were just totally physically wearing themselves out here. I mean, they're panicking, they're running around, it's been a long day of hiking. I mean, this is a bad situation. This was exactly the scenario the Park Service had warned Mike about weeks earlier. Mike felt totally sick that he'd ignored the warning and now led him and his friend into danger. However, as Mike was looking around wondering what they were going to do, he saw a solution. He got close to Steven's ear so Steven could hear him over the howling wind, and he said that their best bet was to hunker down in the trees that surrounded the ridge. The trees would block a lot of the wind and they could just rough it out for the night, and then in the morning, once conditions improved, they could hike the rest of the way back. Now, both men knew this was going to be a very unpleasant way to spend the night, but what other choice did they have? So, starting to feel really scared, the shivering, aching, and exhausted men walked down into the trees. The following morning, March 19th, 2020, Mike woke up feeling very delirious, and immediately he felt ice and snow pelting his face. They were in the middle of a huge storm. He looked over and saw Steven was also awake, and he looked miserable. Over the previous night, a huge snowstorm that they had not seen on the forecast had blown in and basically blocked any chance they would have to make it back to safety. Mike pulled out his phone, hoping miraculously he now had a signal, but there was still nothing. And so all the two friends could do now was just sit there and try to wait out the storm. Now, as cold and awful as this was, Mike knew that a lot of times these storms in late winter and early spring in this part of the world were very quick. And so maybe once the ice and snow passed, the temperature would warm back up, and they'd at least be able to make it back to a spot that had cell service. However, as the day went on, the storm did not prove to be quick, and the cold just kept getting worse and worse. Mike couldn't stop shivering, and he started to feel like he was struggling to breathe. And if that wasn't bad enough, hunger pains had also begun to drive both of them crazy. All they'd had to eat in 2 full days was just a couple of candy bars. And so at some point that afternoon, purely out of desperation, Mike began digging up chunks of ice and snow all around him and began shoveling them into his mouth, as if they were food. But as he chewed, he felt something warm running down his chin, and he realized it was blood. The ice was cutting his lips and gums. Mike spit the blood out onto the white snow-covered ground all around them. He wiped his face and then just sat back down. Eating ice was not an option. Mike didn't bother pulling out his book to look through it. He knew it didn't contain anything that would help him or his friend get out of the mess they were in. At this point, Mike was just worried about Beth, home alone and waiting for him. Mike loved her so much and believed so completely that he could find this treasure and change their lives, that he had never really listened to Beth when she told him all the time that she didn't want the treasure, she just wanted him. But instead, Mike had always listened to the author of this book. Mike and Steve did their best to try to keep each other's spirits up. But the cold, the hunger, and the growing dehydration made it too difficult to focus. Eventually, they both began to drift in and out of consciousness. Two days after heading out on their snowmobiles, so on March 20th, Mike and Steven were still hunkered down by the trees, trying to shield themselves from the elements. By this point, they'd lost all sense of time, and they both were delirious. However, all of a sudden on this day, they heard something that gave them hope for the first time since the storm had started. it was the sound of a helicopter. The men forced themselves up to their feet and they hustled through the snow into this small clearing, and they looked up at the sky and waved their arms over their heads, but there was no helicopter. And so they realized if there had been a helicopter, they must have missed it. It must have already flown by. However, this didn't discourage them. To them, the helicopter meant there must be a search and rescue team out looking for them. They just had to hold on for a bit longer and they'd be saved. And so for the rest of that day and into the night, Mike and Steven just sat there in that clearing, hoping the helicopter would come back. But hitting hikers if he just flew around the area where they had gone missing. As the pilot flew along, he looked down at the ground below. Now there was a layer of mist that covered most of the area, but overall the visibility was still much better than it had been during the storm. And then suddenly the pilot thought he saw movement on the ground. He banked his helicopter and slowly descended to try to get a better view, and as he did, he looked down through the mist that was beginning to part, and as he saw what was down there, he quickly grabbed his radio. There, in the clearing right beneath him, was one of the hikers, waving up enthusiastically at the sky. The pilot called it in over his radio, and then before long he had landed as other members of the search and rescue team arrived at the same spot. They quickly provided first aid to the hiker, and they discovered that other than being cold and a bit dehydrated, he was okay. But when they asked him what he was doing way out here and where his hiking partner was, the man just kept on trying to tell them about some kind of book. This book, the book Mike was carrying with him, was called The Thrill of the Chase, and the author was a man named Forrest Fenn. So for most of his life, Forrest Fenn was known as a famous art dealer. He owned a gallery 500 miles south of Dinosaur National Monument in New Mexico, and he had a reputation for being able to track down rare pieces of art that nobody else could find. And so because of this, people called him a real-life Indiana Jones. However, late in Forrest's life, he started to get weird. He stopped spending as much time at his art gallery and began spending a lot of time in the woods. He became increasingly obsessed with his legacy and with the stories in the adventure books that he'd read when he was young, like Treasure Island, Robin Hood, and The Legend of King Arthur. And also, he started writing. And what he wrote was his book, The Thrill of the Chase, which was kind of a memoir, except that it was totally insane. Because in it, Forrest Fenn said he'd filled a literal treasure chest with $1.5 million worth of gold and jewels and hidden it somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. And in this book, he wrote a cryptic poem that was supposed to contain 9 clues that would lead the reader to the gold. When the book was published in 2010, it created what may have been the biggest treasure hunt in American history. But this treasure hunt did not result in anyone getting rich. Instead, over the course of a decade, hundreds of people searched the Rocky Mountains looking for the gold, but nobody could find it. And also, 4 people who went out searching for it died. And so as a result of that, officials began begging Forrest Fenn to call off his treasure hunt before more people died. But Forrest refused. Both Beth and Steven didn't believe in the treasure. They thought this whole thing was a hoax. However, they knew Mike absolutely believed this treasure was real. And by following this book into the wilderness looking for the treasure, Mike was actually just putting himself in potentially mortal danger. And so really the only reason Steven agreed to go with Mike on this quest was not to go find treasure, but, to support his friend and also try to keep Mike safe. However, it would turn out this quest was going to be far more hazardous than either men could have anticipated. Early on the morning of March 21st, when Mike woke up and felt that warmth all over his body that signaled to him that he and Steven had survived the storm, he stood up in that clearing where they had seen the helicopter, and for a moment he was happy and excited. He was going to get out of here. But very quickly, his happiness faded. Because it was not just warmth he was feeling. He was now feeling hot. It was so hot that Mike began to feel like his skin was on fire. He had no idea what was happening or why the temperature was rising so quickly, but there was no time to think. Mike ripped off his jacket and hoodie and threw them on the ground, but the burning only intensified. So he peeled off his shirt and tossed that aside too. But now he was so hot that he was sweating and becoming delirious. In a total panic, Mike just lay down on the ground so his skin was right up against the snow, hoping that would finally cool him off. And it did. Slowly, the burning subsided, and with great relief, Mike closed his eyes. When that helicopter pilot touched down in the clearing, he found Stephen, not Mike. It would turn out that heat that Mike had felt that morning that he thought meant they were through the storm and were about to be saved, it was caused by hypothermia, which can actually cause a paradoxical burning sensation and also hallucinations, and often causes people suffering from late-stage hypothermia to rip off their clothes just moments before they die. After locating Stephen, a faction of searchers went off looking for Mike, and they would find his frozen body among the trees, naked from the waist up. Stephen was ultimately airlifted out of the park and would not suffer from any lasting physical injuries. Mike would become the fifth and final victim of Forrest Fenn's book, because 3 months after Mike's death in June of 2020, a man named Jack Stoof actually found Forrest Fenn's treasure. It was hidden in the mountains of Wyoming, over 350 miles from where Mike had been searching. And it was literally gold worth $1.3 million. And so Mike had been right. The treasure was real. He just hadn't been looking in the right place. On the night of November 23, 1983, a 40-year-old man named Jimmy Ferroso sat at the bar of the Condor Club with his date, a 23-year-old dancer named Teresa Hill. The Condor Club was a famous strip club in San Francisco's North Beach area, and Jimmy worked there in a whole bunch of different roles. On any given day, he was the club's doorman, the bouncer, and sometimes its manager. And Jimmy was really good at all these jobs. Jimmy was a big guy, 6 feet tall and over 220 pounds, and he had so much facial hair that people called him the Beard. So he was intimidating and could quickly shut down fights, which made him great at security. But he was also very easygoing and friendly, and so everyone who met and worked with him really liked him, so it made him a great manager too. So on this particular night, although Jimmy was at the club, he was not working. He was there to have fun. He had his cowboy boots on, which he wore when he wanted to dress up, and he was trying his hardest to impress Teresa with endless liquor and lots of trivia about the Condor Club itself. And there were a lot of cool things about the Condor Club. In particular, it was the home of the very first topless dancer in America, a woman named Carol Doda, who did her act from on top of a gigantic white velvet-covered piano on the Condor Club stage. Some of Jimmy's favorite stories to tell were about trying to keep order in the club when Carol's musical intro started. And as he told Teresa all these different stories and kept hitting her with trivia questions, he felt like he was really impressing her. By around 2 a.m., they both were pretty drunk, and the Condor was starting to shut down. All the patrons had cleared out, and Jimmy and Teresa were the last people there, other than the bartender. But neither of them wanted to call it a night yet. So Jimmy caught the bartender's attention and told him to go on home. Since Jimmy was kind of the boss, and everybody loved him, the bartender did what Jimmy asked. Instead of closing up, he gave Jimmy the keys and the run of the club, and then he left. Which meant Jimmy and Teresa were all alone. Jimmy drained the last of the liquor from his glass and looked over at Teresa. He really liked her, and she was new in town, so Jimmy felt like it was important that he show her a good time tonight. And so he found himself kind of looking around the empty club for inspiration on how to do that. So the Condor's main room was an intimate theater with tall 12-foot-high ceilings. And inside of there was a mix of cafe tables and booth seating that faced a stage at the far end of the room, which was where the club's dancers performed, against the backdrop of a huge mirror. And while Jimmy was looking all around this space, he saw something that gave him a really good idea for how to show Teresa a night she would never forget. He grabbed her hand, smiled, and led her away from the bar. A little while later, at around 3 a.m., a man named Art Thanash arrived at the Condor Club. Art didn't work at the Condor Club, he worked at a shipyard in town, and he was actually on his way there now. He was only stopping by the Condor as a favor to the club's owner. The owner was out of town and had asked Art to handle the club's money while he was gone. So Art's plan was just to run this errand and then head to work right after. But when he tried to open the door of the club, he couldn't get in. And this didn't make sense, because the arrangement was supposed to be that the bartender would still be inside, waiting for Art to turn over the money. So the door at this point should still be open. But as Art jiggled the knob and pounded on the door itself, he realized it must be locked from the inside. Art stood there for a second, trying to decide how urgent of a problem this was. The locked door could mean there was some kind of trouble, but he decided that more likely it was just a minor mistake. Maybe the janitor was in there and he had locked the door out of habit. Art couldn't just hang around indefinitely waiting for the janitor to open the door again. He had to get to his own job. So that's what he did. He headed to work and began his shift. But a few hours into his shift, he realized he just couldn't concentrate. He kept thinking about the locked door. Something about it just felt wrong, but he couldn't quite identify what it was. It bothered Art so much that he decided he couldn't wait until lunchtime. So at around 7 a.m., he told his boss at the shipyard that he had to take care of something and that he'd explain it later. Then he headed back to the Condor Club. When he got there, he tried the door again and found that it was still locked. This time, Art was not going to give up. He knew the deadbolt was a very weak brass lock and assumed it would not be that hard to break. So he kicked the door as hard as he could, and it worked. The door popped open. The instant Art was inside, he knew his instincts had been right. Something was horribly wrong at this club. Because from somewhere inside the club, someone was screaming for help. Except when Art looked around, he couldn't see anyone or anything that could explain the screaming. The club appeared to be totally empty. And as Art began frantically looking around for the screaming person, he realized that the acoustics of the screaming didn't make sense. They seemed to be bouncing off the walls, and he couldn't follow them to their origin point. It almost sounded like they were coming from above him, but that didn't make sense at all, because the only thing above him was the ceiling. Art looked up anyway, and the second he did, he gasped, because what he was looking at up there was inconceivable. But as he blinked and it didn't go away, he realized that what he was seeing was really happening. Art sprang into action. This was horrific, but he thought maybe it was still fixable. So he ran over to a panel on the far wall of the club and he flipped a switch, but nothing happened. He flipped it again and again, hoping to hear something start moving around, but no, nothing happened. And that's when he realized the switch must be broken. Art knew he needed to try something different, so he turned around and ran to the staircase that led up the back of the club to the dressing rooms. So in the Condor Club, the dressing rooms were on the second floor, directly above the main stage. Now, most of the dressing rooms were just typical rooms. They had closets and makeup mirrors and bright lights, that was it. Nothing unique about them. However, there was one particular room that did have one unusual feature. It was the dressing room that the famous topless dancer Carol Doda had used. And the unusual thing about this room was that it had a tunnel. This tunnel went down through the floor and led to an opening where you could actually look down onto the stage in the club's main room from the ceiling. And so that's where Art went. He entered Carol Doda's dressing room through the regular door, and then he crawled into that tunnel so he could look down at the horrific thing he had seen from a different overhead angle. And when Art was in that tunnel and finally got a good view of what was happening, he knew this situation was not fixable. He scrambled backwards out of the tunnel, back through the dressing room, down the stairs, and back over to the bar. He picked up the phone and called the police. A little while later, the police and the fire department arrived. They put signs on the Condor Club's doors warning people to stay away. Then they assembled in front of the main stage, looking up, trying to figure out what on earth they were going to do. It was obvious they didn't have much time because the screaming was only getting more and more frantic. They decided to start working on several different possible solutions all at once. One group of firefighters hunched over the panel on the wall, the one with the switch that Art had tried flipping when he first came in. But it was clear the firefighters couldn't get the switch to work either. A second set of firefighters went up to the dressing rooms and tried crawling through that tunnel in the floor like Art had, but that also didn't solve anything. A third group of firefighters worked on the stage itself. They set up 2 ladders, One firefighter stood on one of them with his hands up over his head, and at the same time, another firefighter stood on the stage itself, poking up at the ceiling with a long metal pole. And this approach did seem to be promising. Every few minutes, a chunk of white plaster and dust would fall from the ceiling, which was a good sign, because it meant they were making progress. But the progress was slow. As they worked, the screaming stopped and became whimpering, then silence. Hours would pass by. But finally, one more clump of plaster dropped to the floor, and this loud whirring sound filled the air. And for the first time since they had arrived at the Condor Club, the firefighters and police officers stopped staring at the ceiling. Instead, they watched as something enormous descended toward the floor. Here's what happened hours earlier around 2 a.m., after Jimmy told the bartender to go home. Jimmy felt like his night had been going really well, and when the club door closed behind the bartender, Jimmy had looked around the Condor Club trying to think of a grand finale that would totally blow Teresa away. And he saw it. He grabbed her hand and he led her away from the bar and over to the stage. They climbed up onto the stage together and walked to the center, so they were standing at the gigantic white velvet-covered piano that the topless dancer Carol Doda had used in her act. Jimmy kissed Teresa and then leaned her backwards so that she was laying on top of that piano. His grand finale idea was to be intimate with her on top of this famous piano. And Teresa was into it. They were both very drunk and making out and having a generally excellent time. But remember, Jimmy was wearing his cowboy boots because he was trying to look his best for Teresa. And the thing about cowboy boots is that the toe portion is pointed and extends far enough beyond your actual toes that if you were to, say, hit something small with the toe of your boot, you might not actually feel it. And this was very likely what happened to Jimmy, because Carol Doda's piano did not just sit stationary on the stage. The reason her dressing room had a tunnel in the floor that led down to the main stage was because of the special way that Carol liked to start her act. When the music started playing, she would descend from the ceiling, riding on the white piano, which was suspended by cables and powered by a motorized system like an elevator. The piano would be lowered from the ceiling onto the stage at the beginning of Carol's act, and then it would be raised back up to the ceiling at the end, and she would go back through that tunnel into her changing room. The raising and lowering of the piano was all controlled by two little switches. The first one was the switch on the panel on the wall that both Art and the firefighters were trying to make work, but the second one was right beside the piano. And this second switch was the one that Jimmy must have accidentally hit with the pointed toe of his cowboy boot when he was making out with Teresa on top of the piano. And when he hit that switch, the piano began to rise. But Jimmy and Teresa were too drunk to hear the cables start to whir or feel the piano lift them up. It would have taken about 90 seconds for the piano to get all the way up to the ceiling. And during that time, Jimmy and Teresa didn't notice. They would not realize the danger they were in until it was too late. Fast forward several hours, the moment that firefighters managed to fix the switch mechanism that raised and lowered the piano. The piano's motor had burned out after Jimmy had flipped it on, which was why the switch on the wall didn't work when Art and the firefighters first tried it. But the firefighters chipped away at the ceiling and repaired the mechanism, and when they did, the piano began descending from the ceiling. And when it reached the stage, the firefighters and police officers just stared in shock. Because there, on top of the piano, lay Teresa and Jimmy. Teresa had been the one screaming. She was laying on her back on the piano with Jimmy on top of her. She was bruised and bleeding, but alive. Jimmy was not so lucky. His huge body had been crushed between the piano and the ceiling. This had very likely saved Teresa's life, but it killed Jimmy. Teresa was treated at the hospital and released the same day. When police spoke to Teresa, she would say that she had been so drunk she really couldn't remember anything. As for the Condor Club, it would open back up 2 days later, with the piano still on the stage. But the topless dancer, Carol Doda, stopped using it in her act. She thought the energy was off. Our next story is called Famous. On the evening of January 18th, 1977, a very famous 28-year-old Italian soccer player named Luciano Re Ciccone was hanging out at a perfume shop in Rome with one of his teammates. Luciano and his teammate, whose name was Pietro Gadin, had dinner plans later, so right now they were just killing time till their table opened up. And they knew it was easier to kill time inside the relative privacy of a shop rather than out on the street, because basically everywhere they went, they got recognized by fans who would flock to them asking for their autographs or trying to shake their hands. This was particularly true of Luciano, who was a handsome star midfielder that people called the Blonde Angel. He was almost like the equivalent of Tom Brady or LeBron James, but for late 1970s Italian soccer. So, since Luciano and Pietro were friends with the owner of this perfume shop, they had ducked inside of it. And now they were just laughing and talking and having a relaxed, easy time and just kind of minding their own business. Luciano, who had a very good sense of humor, was just cracking jokes left and right, and Pietro and the perfume shop owner thought it was great. This night was supposed to be a celebration for Luciano, who had just come out of one of the hardest periods he'd ever experienced in his whole career. His beloved coach had died about a month earlier, and then also Luciano had gotten a bad knee injury, which had kept him from playing for weeks. It had all taken a very serious emotional toll on him. But just that afternoon, Luciano had had a big breakthrough. He'd played his first full soccer practice since getting hurt, and this meant he was finally well enough to start again in his team's next soccer game, which was 12 days away. At around 7:30 p.m., the shop owner told Luciano and Pietro that despite having this hilarious time with them, they were going to have to clear out of his shop, because he had an errand to run at the jewelry store next door. Luciano and Pietro said that was fine, they would just go with him. So the three men walked outside together, and almost immediately, as they stepped out onto the street, they started hearing gasps and seeing people point over at them. Luciano and Pietro were sort of preoccupied with, talking about their plans for the night, but both of them paused to wave and smile at the fans. The attention from their fans was very uplifting, and they were careful never to take it for granted. Up ahead, they saw the door of the jewelry store. It wasn't kept locked for safety, like a lot of the jewelry stores in Rome were at this time. So the perfume shop owner pushed it open and led the group inside. The men could see the owner of the store behind his counter with his head down, writing notes inside of a sales ledger. The jewelry store owner was a 44-year-old man named Bruno Tabacchini, and he'd been in the jewelry business for years. However, he was starting to tire of this line of work, and recently he'd been thinking about getting out and trying something new. He just didn't know what. On this evening, however, he wasn't focused on any of that. He was just exhausted from dealing with the steady stream of customers coming in and out. It had been a long day, and he was looking forward to closing up and going home. But all of a sudden, he heard a commotion at the door of his shop. He jerked his head up just as these two men barged in with jackets pulled up over their faces, and then a second later, one of these men shouted out this command that Bruno had heard before. It was a command that both terrified him and enraged him, and it caused him to react immediately. That command was, "Everyone freeze! This is a robbery!" Bruno had been robbed once before, 11 months earlier, and it was terrifying. And now he was reliving that trauma all over again. He could see one of the robbers had his right hand shoved into his pocket, and he was clearly holding something which looked like a gun. And so Bruno knew everybody in this store was now in terrible danger. And so without hesitation, Bruno lunged for a drawer behind the jewelry counter and pulled out a gun of his own, and he raised it into the air. Everything was happening so fast that the people inside the store, including Luciano and Pietro, couldn't even keep up. Luciano, Pietro, and the perfume store owner were facing Bruno, and they gasped when they saw Bruno raise his own gun. Pietro seemed to understand that something very serious was going on, and he threw his hands up in the air in a gesture of surrender. But Luciano was in the middle of telling a joke, and he didn't seem to compute that he was in the midst of an armed standoff. So he kept on with his joke and didn't even try to defend himself or give himself up. It was all happening too fast for Bruno, too. His eyes were solely focused on the armed robber and what they were going to do next. Bruno felt his heart pounding in his ears. He felt like it was him or the armed robber, and his instincts took over, and he squeezed the trigger. There was a loud booming sound, and for a second, it felt like the world froze. Then the armed robber slumped slowly to the ground, and Bruno lowered his gun. In the moment of silence that followed, there was only one sound inside of that jewelry store. It was the voice of the armed robber. He was saying something. It was quiet but distinct, and Bruno was able to make out the words. But this time, unlike when the robbers first burst into the store, the words that the armed robber said, they didn't ring any bells for Bruno. In fact, they made no sense at all. So, as one of the store customers ran out the door to go find a police officer, Bruno just stood there behind his counter in total confusion. So, one thing to keep in mind here is that in Rome in the late 1970s, violent crime was rising fast, and jewelry store robberies were becoming extremely common. In fact, just a few hours before the robbers entered Bruno's store, a different jewelry store in Rome got robbed. This meant that when the police arrived at Bruno's shop, they figured they were just walking into another typical holdup. And when they actually first stepped inside, that is what it looked like. Bruno was behind the counter, freaking out about what had just happened. The unarmed robber was standing in a corner in shock, and the armed robber was laying in the middle of the floor in a pool of blood with a bullet hole in his chest. But then the customers in the store began telling the police the words that the armed robber had said as he fell to the ground. And that's when the police realized this was not a typical robbery. In fact, they knew that what had happened inside of the shop was about to be worldwide news. After Bruno fired that single gunshot into the armed robber, the confusing words the armed robber then uttered were, "It was just a joke." The robbers were not actually robbers. It was Luciano and Pietro. It would turn out Luciano was not just famous for soccer or for his incredible flowing blonde hair that made him instantly recognizable. He was also very well known for his sense of humor. And when he was in a really good mood, like he was on the night of January 18th, 1977, Luciano, aka the Blonde Angel, liked to play practical jokes. So, as Luciano and Pietro had left the perfume shop and fans were yelling to them and waving and they're kind of waving back and they were getting ready to go next door to the jewelry store, well, Luciano pulled Pietro into this conversation where he pitched him his big idea. Why don't we fake a robbery as a prank? Luciano thought it would be hilarious and a great story for this jewelry store owner to tell that he'd been held up by the Blonde Angel himself. But what Luciano didn't count on was that the jeweler, Bruno, had been traumatized by the earlier robbery and was actually considering leaving the jewelry business altogether because of it. And perhaps most importantly, Luciano had no way of knowing that Bruno didn't care at all about soccer. He was probably one of the only people in Rome who wouldn't recognize Luciano or Pietro. So when the two soccer stars ran in pretending to be robbers, Bruno thought it was real. When Bruno pulled out his own gun, Pietro realized immediately that this joke had gone south, and he put his hands in the air to say, "Hey, it's a joke." The perfume shop owner was not involved in this prank at all in the first place, so he just stood there and did nothing. But Luciano, who was in this very playful and happy mood, was slow to recognize the real danger here. And so he pulled out his pretend gun from his pocket, which was actually just his hand with his thumb and forefinger extended, and he playfully aimed it at Bruno. And Bruno, who kind of had tunnel vision at this point, didn't see that he was actually unarmed. Instead, he thought this was real, he's about to get shot himself, and so he fired. Luciano would die in the hospital 30 minutes after being shot. The story of his prank robbery did become international news. Bruno was arrested, but the charges were ultimately dropped because a court decided he was acting genuinely in self-defense. The big soccer game, the one that Luciano was so excited to play in again, that was actually the whole entire reason he was out celebrating to begin with on the night he was killed, was held 12 days later, and instead of celebrating Luciano's heroic comeback, his fans held a moment of silence in his honor. And so, Luciano and Jimmy's stories are a stark reminder that even if you think your crazy idea is a good one, you can't risk it. On the morning of November 18th, 2019, 54-year-old detective Muzi Makizi stood in a long line waiting to get into a courthouse in Ikapa, South Africa. So Muzi was an investigator on a very violent robbery case that was finally being tried today, even though the robbery itself had happened almost 6 years earlier. Back in 2014, a group of armed men had stormed into a couple's farmhouse in Ikapa and brutally beat the couple before making off with a bunch of electronics and jewelry and weapons and other valuables. And so Muzi and his team had eventually caught and arrested these criminals, and in fact, they were even able to recover some of the items that had been stolen. In fact, now, Muzi had one of those stolen items with him to present as evidence at today's trial. Muzi had done this kind of court duty plenty of times in his career, but today, he felt really drained. On top of his trial prep for, this case, he'd also been working other active cases and also mentoring junior detectives. And Muzi was not young and energetic anymore. He was nearing retirement age, and all these obligations were really starting to take a toll on him. But the biggest thing that was really exhausting Muzi was this robbery case itself. It had been an extremely long process, full of an unusual number of delays and complications. It had actually taken so long to bring this to trial that the evidence Muzi was holding, like literally right now, had actually been returned to the victim couple so they could use it until the trial finally happened. So getting this case to this point had been extremely tiring, but Muzi and his team were determined to see it through no matter what. Because the criminals that did this, they were incredibly violent and genuinely needed to be behind bars to protect the public. They'd severely beaten this couple to the point where they were hospitalized, and it was lucky they hadn't been killed. As Muzi entered the courthouse and passed through the court security checkpoint, he hoped the security guards were appropriately on alert. In his experience, violent offenders, like the ones who were on trial today, often had violent friends, especially in Ikapa, where this kind of crime was unfortunately rampant. It wasn't unheard of for criminals or gang members to barge into court proceedings and retaliate against cops or prosecution. But Muzi was able to get through security. There was no suspicious people or any sort of disruptions of any kind. And so Muzi, once through, made his way into the courtroom. And he saw the space was already full. The defense and the jury and prosecutors and judge were all there, and there were members of the public in the gallery. Muzi went over and sat down at the prosecution table, and he would remain there until it was his turn to go up to the judge and present, which would include, showing this evidence. As Muzi got settled into his seat and, put the evidence down in his lap, he turned and sort of gave a quick wave to the prosecutor, a woman named Adelaide Ferreira-Watt, who was sitting at the table as well. She was going over her trial notes. Muzi had worked with Adelaide before, and they got along really well together. And she was a total pro, at least in Muzi's mind. So he knew that, her being on board meant this case had a really good chance of getting a conviction. Adelaide waved back at Muzi and then quickly got back to her notes. And Muzi took a look around the courtroom and everything seemed quiet and, again, there was no sign of any gang members or criminal friends charging in to cause problems. And, Muzi just hoped it would stay this way and that the trial would go smoothly and end the way he hoped it would. A few minutes later, and the judge sort of called the court to order and got the trial started, at which point Adelaide got up and began to present the case. And at this moment, despite the fact that Muzi had waited almost 6 years to get to this point, at this moment when it finally was happening, he just felt this enormous wave of exhaustion sweep over him. He wasn't energized, it was sort of the opposite. It was like relief. And also, the room they were in was pretty hot and, he was pretty tired, and before long, his eyelids got heavier and heavier, and eventually his head kind of slumped over to the side, and he dozed off. And at first, everything was fine. For a couple of minutes, Muzi just slept in the courtroom, and nobody even noticed or cared. Everything was okay. But then at some point, there was this sudden, very loud scraping sound. It was the sound of a bunch of chairs in the courtroom moving across the ground, and it was just very loud, and it woke Muzi up, but like really abruptly. He was startled by the sound, and when he woke up, like in his, sudden jolting awake, he dropped the evidence that he was supposed to be in charge of onto the ground. And so he's getting up, he's getting his bearings, realizing that it's kind of embarrassing. He was asleep. Did anybody see him? Like, what's going on? Everyone's moving around. He sees the evidence on the ground, so he goes under the table, he scoops the evidence back up, and as he's sitting back up, he hears this loud, deafening bang echo through the courtroom, and he still really doesn't know what's going on. I mean, he just woke up, it's sort of chaotic in the room, and then he hears this scream coming from the side, sort of over to his right, and he turns and he realizes the scream came from the prosecutor, Adelaide. And so Muzi looks over the table and he sees Adelaide laying on the ground and she's clutching her hip, and her hip is now gushing blood. And so obviously she's been attacked. That loud banging sound he heard was almost certainly a gunshot or an explosion of some kind. And so Muzi immediately is thinking, clearly the friends or affiliates of these criminals on trial have stormed the courthouse and they've attacked us. They've attacked Adelaide. Are there more shooters here? Are there more attackers in the building? And so Muzi, who again, he's only woken up 30 seconds ago, he's still sort of confused. He begins looking around the courthouse for, perpetrators, someone who's attacking, a gunman or something. But all he sees is just the chaos of people trying to flee the courthouse and others rushing up to Adelaide to try to render care. There were no perpetrators, there were no gunmen, there was nothing, it was just chaos. And so for a second, Muzi is just sitting there, not really even sure what to do, almost paralyzed by shock, and also, again, he's just woken up, he's sort of getting his bearings. And then he thinks of something, he's looking around the courthouse, this crazy scene, and he realizes that there is no gunman, there's no perpetrator, there's nobody, there's nothing. Which can only mean one thing. So to understand what happened inside of that courtroom, you first have to understand something about South African police procedure. And that is that in South Africa, as in most countries, after evidence is taken from the scene of a crime, it's examined and determined to be safe and then transferred to an exhibit room until it's time for trial. However, unlike in other parts of the world, in South Africa, there are exceptions to this procedure. And this trial had taken almost 6 years to start. And because of that huge time lag, some of the evidence that was recovered from the robbers' homes had actually been returned to the victim couple it was taken from, so they could just use it until the trial finally happened. The couple had returned that particular evidence to the police that morning, and Muzi had been charged with bringing that evidence to court and literally holding that evidence. But Muzi, when he did this, didn't double check to make sure this evidence was safe to be in a courtroom. And sometime after Muzi fell asleep in the courtroom, the judge had announced that it was time to take a break. And so the scraping of chairs that woke him up was the sound of people getting up to leave. But for Muzi, it startled him and he sat up really suddenly, what's going on? And he dropped this evidence onto the ground. And it would turn out this was the worst thing that could have possibly happened. Because this particular evidence was a shotgun. And when Muzi, sort of in his panicked, instinctive state, when he first woke up and he saw the evidence on the ground, he reached down to grab it, to pick it back up, because he was supposed to hold this thing for the whole trial and present it. The last thing he needed is people to see that he had fallen asleep and dropped it on the ground. But when he scooped it up, the gun, again, because it had not been re-examined, it would turn out it was still loaded. And so as he scooped it up, he accidentally hit the trigger and fired it, and it hit Adelaide, severed an artery, and killed her. But Muzi, was so confused by the chaos of the scene that at first, he didn't even realize he had fired the gun. He just scooped up the gun, heard the bang, and he's like, what's going on here? And it was when he realized there was no gunman that he looked down and he realized the shotgun was aimed right at Adelaide. He must have shot her. Muzi ultimately pled guilty to culpable homicide and negligence, and he was ordered to serve a 6-year prison sentence. However, it was suspended. Our second and final story is called Legacy. On the morning of July 14th, 1912, a 21-year-old athlete named Francisco Lazaro stood in his hotel room in Stockholm, Sweden, getting dressed and ready for the day. And he was in Sweden to run the marathon in the Olympics. So a marathon is a race that covers exactly 26.2 miles. And for elite runners, it usually takes them between 2 and 3 hours to finish. Lázaro was representing Portugal, and this was actually a really big deal. This was his home country's very first Olympics, which meant Lázaro was one of only a few Portuguese athletes at the Games. And Lázaro believed that out of all of those people, all those other Portuguese athletes, he actually stood the best chance at bringing home an actual medal. So Lázaro had a chance to do something really historic for his country. And realistically, he wasn't even that nervous, because he knew he was a truly elite, incredible runner. Even though he was just 21 years old, Lázaro had already won 3 huge marathons in Portugal. So he was already a star back home. But he knew that if he wanted to win on the world stage, he would need to come extremely prepared. So that's exactly what he'd done. He'd trained for months, obviously. He'd also recently gotten a medical exam to confirm that he was very healthy. And he'd even begun thinking about, little ways that he could potentially give himself a boost, like how to fuel, what to put in his body and even what to put on his body. I mean, even the smallest detail, like a shirt that wasn't breathable or eating something that kind of sat heavily in his stomach, could make the difference between winning or losing. Because again, this is like the world's best runners. Any little edge, he was going to take it. So now, Lázaro spent the next hour putting on the very specific clothes that he had selected for this race, and also eating a perfectly balanced light meal containing carbohydrates and protein, basically exactly what he had mapped out to help him in this race. He'd been warned that it was supposed to be very, very hot today on race day. But Lázaro actually saw this as an advantage, because being from Portugal, where it often got much hotter than places like Sweden, Lázaro already knew how to protect himself from the sun and the heat, and how to give himself an edge in this weather. And then before he knew it, Lázaro was ready to go, and he had left his hotel room, and he was on his way to the stadium to actually compete in the Olympics. A few hours later, around 1:45 p.m., Lázaro walked out into the middle of Stockholm's massive stadium where the race was going to start. And as race officials directed him and his 67 other competitors to their places at the starting line, Lázaro was feeling really confident. In fact, so confident that he called out to a nearby reporter that he was going to be the winner, saying, quote, "I win or I die." Now, as Lázaro and the others actually took their spots on the starting line, they were in the direct sunlight, and it was just unbelievably hot. I mean, in the shade, it was already 90 degrees, so it was like a sweltering day. But as Lázaro looked up and down the line of the other competitors, he saw everybody else look flushed, and they were sweating profusely. They looked not ready to go run 26.2 miles in this heat. They looked overwhelmed. But Lázaro, he was not overwhelmed. He was prepared. In fact, Lázaro wasn't even sweating. As Lázaro stood there waiting for this race to start, he could hear the roar of the thousands of people in the stands. And for a moment, he just stood there taking it all in and just, appreciating how special this moment really was. The marathon was a major event in these Olympics. The stadium was completely sold out, and even the king and queen of Stockholm were supposed to be somewhere in the crowd watching this. And as Lázaro stood there having this moment, sort of taking it all in, he also had this certainty that when this race was finished, all those people in the stadium and around the world, even royalty, would know his name. Just then, he heard the announcer tell the runners to take their marks. And Lázaro felt a surge of adrenaline rush through him. A big hush fell over the crowd, and Lázaro and the rest of the racers stopped moving and just tensed, waiting for the signal. A couple of seconds went by, and then, bang, the starting gun went off, and Lázaro and everybody else lunged forward. And there was a bit of jostling as all the competitors surged off the line, and Lázaro was pushed back towards the middle of the pack. And right off the bat, Lázaro was a little surprised by how quick the overall pace was. But Lázaro still wasn't worried. He'd studied this course extensively, and he knew that he'd have a chance to get out in front of his competitors pretty soon. This marathon route was very flat, but Lázaro was used to competing in Portugal, which had much more mountainous terrain. So he was sure that once the other runners invariably started to get tired, especially from this hot weather, he'd still be feeling fine, and he could move out in front. So Lázaro just decided to hang back and wait to make his move as they moved out of the stadium and onto the dirt road beyond. And for the next hour and a half, he stuck to his plan and just kept his pace steady in the back. He knew, at some point, people would begin falling off as the heat wore down on them and they got tired, and he'd be able to make his way up, so he wasn't rushing. He was just waiting, biding his time, staying confident. In fact, as he was sort of keeping his pace in the back, he even was able to give another soundbite to one of the reporters that was on the road, telling her that he was feeling great. For the first half of this marathon, Lazzaro really felt like he was running the race of his life. It was like everything in his training and in his background had prepared him to excel here on the world stage. He was consistently moving past runners, some of whom were really struggling in the heat because they clearly weren't used to it. Some had actually stopped running altogether and just put their hands on their knees, while others just sat on the ground, unable to get up. So basically everything was playing out exactly the way Lazzaro expected it to. He was, making his move slowly but surely towards the front of the pack. However, as great as this race was going for Lazzaro, something changed at around the 19-mile mark. He just felt really off. His legs got a really heavy, just like lead feeling, and a few minutes later, his vision started to get blurry. Lazzaro kept on running and, told himself he was fine, and that this was just, late race fatigue kicking in. And for what it's worth, it is pretty common for marathon runners to say that at about the 19 to 20 mile mark, that's sort of the real halfway of the race, not the 13-mile mark. The 20-mile mark is where your body really starts to struggle. That last 6 miles is notoriously brutal. And so he's basically saying that that's normal. This happens when you hit about 20 miles. And so as Lazzaro worked as hard as he could to put one foot in front of the other and just to keep on going, he began telling himself that, this was worth it. At the end of this, there was a stadium packed with people who would be screaming his name, and he was still making such great progress. He could still win this race. But then, just a little bit later, his legs went from feeling heavy to just completely giving out. And he slammed to the ground, and then his whole body began to convulse. Within the hour, at a local hospital, an emergency doctor greeted a crew of Olympic medical staff as they wheeled in a man on a stretcher. They explained that this man was named Francisco Lazzaro, and he'd collapsed in the middle of the marathon. And the doctor was really not surprised by this. He knew the Olympic paramedics had been swamped all day, helping other marathon runners who'd gotten sick from this really oppressive heat. However, as soon as this doctor began specifically examining Lazzaro, he knew that this case was different and was much, much more serious. His other patients that day had all relatively mild symptoms like sweating and general fatigue and dizziness, which had easily been cured by providing water and cooling them off. But Lazzaro, he was twitching and convulsing, and he was shouting deliriously that he'd won the race. So the doctor rushed him into an exam room and took his temperature. And when he saw it was 106.7 degrees Fahrenheit, he knew this situation was critical. A temperature that high was often fatal, and Lazzaro's organs were likely already shutting down. And so the doctor yelled for nurses and other medical staff to bring in some water and some ice, but Lazzaro, he did not respond to the hospital's treatments. And as the hours passed by, Lazzaro actually got worse. The doctor and his team, they worked through the night treating Lazzaro and trying to stabilize him. But the next morning, Lazzaro died. After Lazzaro's death, that doctor just could not shake the idea that something just felt off about Lazzaro's death. Heat stroke can definitely be deadly, and Lazzaro had seemed to have a very bad case of heat stroke, but lots of runners had gotten heat stroke during this marathon, and all of them had wound up being fine. So the doctor ultimately decided to run some tests on Lazzaro to see if maybe there was something else that had been going on, like maybe there was some underlying illness or other factor that was to blame for his death. And when the doctor finally did get those tests back, the results made Lazzaro famous. So remember, Lazzaro had put a lot of thought into how to prepare for this big race. He trained extremely hard, he ate right, he chose the right clothes, the right shoes, and critically, he took very specific measures to protect himself from the heat, which he knew was going to be a factor. And at first, it seemed like all the measures he had taken in advance of this race had paid off. especially when Lazaro looked down the line at the start and he saw all the other runners were like pouring sweat and flush and just looking horrible. It just seemed like everybody was already exhausted before they had even started. But not Lazaro. He wasn't even sweating because of one of the precautions he had taken. But not sweating in this type of heat was actually a very bad thing. Sweat is the body's way of cooling itself down. So Lazaro's lack of sweat was actually a sign that he was in danger. And it was all thanks to Lazaro's extra strong sunscreen. Because it would turn out Lazaro was so prepared that he went out and found what he thought would be the best and most powerful sunscreen option ever. It was a substance called suet, which is a type of animal fat that's typically used in cooking or making candles and soap. It's also sometimes used for skincare, since it has a lot of nutrients and is generally good for the skin. And Lazaro believed that because suet is very thick, it would act as a barrier against the intensity of the sun. So he slathered a bunch of suet all over his body just before the big race. What he didn't anticipate was that this suet that was now all over him would work too well. It was so thick that it clogged the pores in his skin and prevented anything from passing through, even sweat. And without a way to cool itself down, Lazaro's body essentially turned into a furnace, which cooked him from the inside out. The weekend after Lazaro's death, the Olympics held a memorial service for him, and over 20,000 people attended to pay tribute to him. And it's probably not quite the type of fame he had hoped for, but Lazaro's name is still frequently referenced today in Portugal. The Portuguese refer to someone who looks sick and bedraggled as looking like Lazaro. The Mr. Ballen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio, Perry Crowell, and Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the Mr. Ballen podcast, you can also now watch on the Mr. Ballen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In today's episode, I'm going to tell 2 stories that are each about sort of joyful events or celebrations. But in both cases, they take a horrible turn just because of one small decision. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the follow button that you have something really important you want to tell them, and they need to hurry and come to your house as soon as possible, but make sure you leave before they get there. Okay? On the morning of July 23, 2006, a 74-year-old artist named Maurice Agus paced back and forth near an art exhibit in Riverside Park in Chesterless Street, England. And Maurice was frustrated because this was supposed to be one of the biggest days of his entire 40-year career as an artist. Right now, his exhibit, his masterpiece, should be full of people, but it wasn't. So Maurice's exhibit was called Dream Space. It was this massive structure about half the size of a soccer field, and inside of it was the sprawling network of small, colorful, interconnected rooms. Dream Space was designed so that visitors could sort of wander from room to room and be affected by the music and soothing lighting and have kind of an immersive, serene experience. And this was by far the largest physical exhibit that Maurice had ever done. So it had taken a lot of preparation, and naturally there had been some construction hiccups, but it was all going to be worth it because Maurice knew it was about to be seen by a lot of people since it was located in a really big public park. However, before they could actually open, there was still one more hiccup to deal with. This morning, when Maurice had arrived, he'd realized that part of his exhibit had not been set up correctly. So he and his staff had spent the last few hours rushing around to fix everything and add some finishing touches to the exterior. And Maurice knew they really needed to hurry here because making these changes had already taken up way too much time and they were already late in opening the exhibit. Maurice could see that there were guests who had already purchased tickets who were lining up at the entrance to get into Dreamspace. And they looked confused and sort of annoyed about why they weren't inside already. And so naturally, Maurice was afraid that if he didn't wrap this up soon and start letting people in, these people would just start leaving, which meant they would not get to see how amazing his masterpiece was, and that would be just devastating. So at this point, Maurice just stepped back and he looked at what he and his staff had done so far in terms of fixes. And he decided that, things were looking good enough. They'd addressed the major issues that he had had. And even though Maurice was ultimately a perfectionist and would have liked to do even more additions, just getting Dreamspace open at this point was way more important. So Maurice told his staff to stop what they were doing and go to the entrance and start letting the visitors in. A few hours later, around 3:15 p.m., 68-year-old Elizabeth Collings walked into Riverside Park with her 14-year-old grandson. They lived in the area, and they had just decided to take a walk together in the park. And Elizabeth was glad they had. It was like the perfect summer day. There was a light breeze. It was very sunny and warm. And so with the wind rustling her hair and her grandson happily walking beside her, she felt very at peace. But just then, her grandson stopped and sort of broke her peace by telling her to, "Hey, look at this." And Elizabeth turned and looked, where her grandson was pointing. And she saw on the other side of the park, there was this sprawling, colorful structure with a huge line of people out front and soothing music coming from its open doors. And Elizabeth thought, whatever that is, it looked really intriguing and not like anything she had ever seen before. So she was just excited as her grandson to go check it out. And so she said, "Let's go." Just a few minutes later, and Elizabeth and her grandson had purchased their tickets and actually stepped inside the exhibit. And Elizabeth knew instantly that this had been a great idea. The lights were dim inside, and the colorful walls seemed to almost glow as they went from room to room. And all around them, the dreamy, tranquil music played. And even though it was fairly crowded and pretty hot inside, it still felt quite peaceful. And Elizabeth could feel her entire body just sort of relax. And for the next 10 minutes or so, she and her grandson just wandered around slowly, taking in the atmosphere and the lights and the music. It was really nice. At some point, they made their way into this room which had this beautiful blue hue to it. And there was some light coming in from the room next to them, which was sort of brownish. And when the color of the room they were in and this brownish light combined, it sort of had this effect of making the room feel almost green, and then mixed with the music, it was just this really cool experience. And both Elizabeth and her grandson were just sort of transfixed, sort of taking in this really cool exhibit. But as they were taking this in, all of a sudden, there was this deafening snapping sound. And the moment that snapping sound happened, Elizabeth suddenly felt dizzy and disoriented, and as she stared at all the colors around her, the room seemed to almost tilt, and she found herself stumbling a few steps, like the room was moving and she was losing her balance. And at first she wondered if maybe the lights and the heat were just getting to her, except then she couldn't help but have this almost floating sensation, like the room itself was moving away from her. And then she realized her feet were no longer touching the floor. The creator of Dreamspace, Maurice, had been outside with the guests who were in line waiting to get into the exhibit. And so far, the day really had been going great. I mean, he had done all those last-minute changes and fixes to the exhibit, and he had sort of got it done just in time to open it up, and now all these people are here, and there's at least 40 some odd people in line with more and more joining, and everybody who comes out of the exhibit is beaming and talking about what an incredible experience it was. I mean, the day had been going great for Maurice until he heard that snapping sound. When that loud snap rang out, everybody heard it, and then Maurice, who was looking away from dream space, he began hearing screams behind him. And then before he could say or do anything, he just sort of whipped around and looked, and all he saw were these shapes just falling from the sky and smashing into the ground. And at first, Maurice and everybody else around him didn't even know what they were. Then suddenly Maurice realized those shapes were people. So earlier in the day, when Maurice and his staff were sort of hustling to get all those last-minute fixes done on this exhibit so they could open it to the public, well, Maurice, who knew this was going to be his last big art exhibit, this was like the end of his career, it was supposed to be the exclamation point on a storied career here, he was so worried that if he didn't get the doors open fast enough, that people in line were going to leave and not even show up, and it would be this catastrophic failure, that he ultimately basically stopped his staff from finishing all the renovations, all the fixes he needed to do, in favor of just getting people in the door. And the way he sort of rationalized it was, well, I'm a perfectionist, and I would have liked to have done all the fixes, but I did enough. It's good enough. Let's get this place open. Let's send people in. The problem with that is some of the things that he overlooked in his haste to open up the front doors for the public included vital safety precautions. Some of these missed safety precautions included tying down a series of extra ropes to anchor the exhibit to the ground. The staff had ultimately tied down the front of the structure, but, because Maurice rushed them to get the place open, they didn't anchor the back of the exhibit. And this would turn out to be just a catastrophic oversight. Dreamspace was not a regular permanent art exhibit. It was not made of walls and concrete with a real foundation. It was an inflatable exhibit made of plastic sheeting, sort of like what shower curtains are made of. So even though there was just a light breeze going through the park that day, it was enough to sort of suddenly lift the entire Dreamspace structure out of the ground, because again, there was just a couple of anchors, not a full set of anchors, and so suddenly the wind yanks the space out of the ground. That was the snapping sound. And so basically this big structure turned into like a giant hot air balloon, and everybody inside of it, the dozens of people, including Elizabeth and her grandson, were thrown 30 feet into the air, and they're all trapped inside of this plasticky structure that's contorting in the wind up at 30 feet. And as the wind picked up, the higher up they went, the Dreamspace structure, as it contorted, began ejecting all of the people inside of it out. And so that's why when Maurice looked, he saw all these people falling to the ground. In the end, 27 people were injured and 2 were killed, including Elizabeth Collings. As for Maurice Agus, the creator of Dreamspace, he was convicted of a health and safety violation and given a fine. But despite that being a relatively light punishment relative to what happened, he was so devastated by the destruction that his creation caused that he never made anything like it again. This was the last piece of art he ever did. And in fact, he died just 3 years later in 2009. Our second and final story today is called Early Riser. At 5 a.m. on December 24th, 1885, 30-year-old Samuel Wardell abruptly sat up in his bed in New York City, having just been woken up by the sound of his deafening alarm clock. And just like every other morning, Samuel immediately got up out of his bed and he trudged across the floor of his one-bedroom apartment to the shelf where his alarm clock was, and he reset it. Now, the placing of this alarm clock was very intentional. Samuel was a very, very heavy sleeper, and so by putting the clock all the way over there, it forced him to get out of bed, walk all the way across the room to reset it, and then ideally, he just wouldn't go back to bed. And for the most part, he wouldn't. Now, it can't be overstated just how heavy a sleeper Samuel actually was. In fact, he'd actually taken another step to make sure that he really could not sleep through his alarm. He'd made some additional alterations to the alarm clock that made it way louder. Now, this did seem sort of like overkill to most people who knew about it, but it was hard to argue with the results. Samuel had not been late to work in years, and that was really important because Samuel had a very early morning job that he didn't want to lose. He was a city lamplighter. In 1885, large parts of New York City still relied on gas-burning streetlights when it got dark outside. So the way it worked is there was a night shift lamplighter, not Samuel, this is somebody else, who would go around the city and light those lights at dusk. And then in the early morning hours, the morning lamplighter, Samuel, would go put them out again. And so that's why he had to get up early to go put out the lamps. And even though Samuel really didn't like getting up this early, the reality is he did need the job. And also, too, he had sort of grown fond of the job. He had a lot of fun doing it. Over the years, he'd become very friendly with basically everybody on his local route, and so he didn't mind it. Getting up was painful, but it was worth it. Samuel actually had become so close with the people on his route that night he was going to be throwing this big Christmas party for all these people. It was like all his friends from his job were going to come over and celebrate with him, and he was really excited about it. But that was not going to be until much later that night. For now, he just needed to reset his alarm clock, get dressed, and go out and put out those lamps. Fast forward to the end of the night, and Samuel now he's done with his work, he's back home, all his friends are over, and he's pouring some ale from this big barrel that his friends had brought over for this party, and he's just having a great time. The single room of his tiny apartment was now packed with about 30 people, and they too were all having just a great time. They didn't care how small it was. This was just like an awesome party. Now, by this point, Samuel and his friends had already spent the last few hours drinking, and so they were quite drunk, but they were having a great time, laughing and eating, and everyone's just having so much fun. And so even though it was definitely getting late, and Samuel did have to work the next day, it just felt like the party was not about to end anytime soon, and Samuel was not quite ready to turn it off yet. He was having too good of a time. And so when one of his friends randomly stood up and sort of drunkenly suggested they have an amateur boxing match, Samuel immediately voiced his approval. Along with everybody else, they cheered. They're like, yeah, let's do it. And so Samuel and the other party guests, they cleared the furniture out from, the single room, to set up the boxing ring. And then Samuel and the others all stood back and cheered while two of their friends began, fighting each other in the middle of the apartment. It was like this totally crazy, booze-fueled just madness happening inside of this place. And Samuel was having the time of his life, not thinking remotely about how absolutely miserable it was going to be waking up in now just a few hours when his alarm went off at 5 a.m. He was just doing his best not to think about it. Enjoy the party, that's it. And so for a while, the madness continued until eventually people did get really tired and began leaving, and before long, it was just Samuel standing in his now totally destroyed apartment from this party. And so at this point, Samuel, he looked at his clock and he saw he had, barely 2 hours before he would have to get up for work, and he's thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be so awful. I'm going to feel so miserable. But it was totally worth it. What a great party. And so very drunkenly, Samuel kind of stumbled his way over to his bed. He just fell right down on top of it, and he fell asleep. And sure enough, just about 2 hours later at 5 a.m. sharp, his alarm went off. Hours later, on Christmas afternoon, a local police officer walked up to Samuel Wardell's front door and knocked. The officer was there because Samuel's boss had called the station when Samuel had failed to show up for work that morning. And this was so out of character for Samuel that right away his boss contacted the police and said, please, someone needs to go check on him and make sure he's okay. And so now the officer waited at the door for Samuel. But when no one answered, he tried the door handle. And he found it was locked, but this was a very rickety, tiny home, and the officer could tell it would not take much to basically kick the door in. And so after calling out for Samuel a few more times and knocking, pretty loud and still not getting a response, the officer just stepped back and then kicked the door and blasted it open. And so the officer stepped inside the home and immediately saw Samuel. And when he did, he understood why he had missed work. It would turn out when Samuel went to bed after his big party, he forgot to move his bed back into the position that it normally was in. He had moved the furniture around for that boxing match and just didn't put it back. And so instead, he wound up going to sleep with his bed all the way across the room, under the shelf where he kept his alarm clock. And this was like the worst place for Samuel to fall asleep. Because, he had set his alarm to go off at 5 a.m. the following morning, just like he did every day. But his alarm clock was not a normal alarm clock. Samuel had intentionally altered his alarm clock to be way louder than a standard alarm clock. But the way he had done that was fairly unique. He had run a wire between a normal alarm clock and this shelf that had hinges. Basically, the shelf could, be situated like this, or it could fold down, basically making it flush to the wall. So it could hold stuff or be flush to the wall. And so when his normal wind-up alarm clock would go off in the morning and begin to ring, it would begin to vibrate and would sort of move across the shelf. And connected to it was this wire that ran to the hinges. And at a certain point, when this alarm sort of got far enough, it would pull enough to disable the hinges, and the shelf that was situated like this would suddenly fall. And in order to make this alarm really, really loud, Samuel had put a 10-pound rock on that shelf. So the instant the hinges dropped, that 10-pound rock came crashing down and smashed into the floor, causing a huge noise that consistently woke Samuel up. But on the morning after his big party, because Samuel was sleeping now directly under the shelf because he didn't move his bed back, that 10-pound rock didn't hit the ground. It fell and smashed directly into Samuel's head and broke his skull. After being discovered by that police officer, Samuel was rushed to a local hospital, but later died from his injuries. The Mr. Ballen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio, Perry Crowell, and Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the Mr. Ballen podcast, you can also now watch on the Mr. Ballen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today we have 2 stories that are each about people who really craved attention or status. But instead of getting that, they got carnage. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to get the follow button some brand new tires for their car. But don't tell them you're going to install monster. One afternoon in early September of 2004, 20-year-old Derek Keeper sat at a desk in the newspaper lab at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, furiously typing on one of the school's desktop computers. The lab that Derek was in was the hub of the university's school paper, the Daily Nebraskan. So there were some other students who were in the space that were talking or working at other computers. But Derek didn't notice any of them. He was completely locked in on what he was doing and writing as fast as he could. Because after he was done with the article that he was working on, he had a ton of other responsibilities that he needed to tackle. So Derek was involved in a lot of stuff at school. He was in a fraternity, he was a senator in the student government, he was a research assistant for the library, and he was pursuing 5 different majors. And Derek took all of his various commitments very, very seriously. But the column he was currently writing was really the one he had the most fun with. So Derek was from a small city in Nebraska, And even though he'd always been, personally a very loud and opinionated person, he'd never had a real platform for talking about all the ideas and points of views that he had. And so this column really gave him the opportunity to finally, actually present these big ideas to the students at school, and he hoped would likely provoke lively discussions around campus about his ideas. After all, Derek loved a good debate, and so he would intentionally choose to write about really complex issues that would get his readers fired up, like the ongoing war in Iraq and the future of the Republican Party and all the things that were wrong with local politics. The tone he went for when he wrote and talked about these kind of, contentious things was often very sarcastic, very blunt, and provocative. I mean, he really thrived on creating discourse and getting people to passionately disagree with him. And they usually definitely did, to the point where some even would get very mad with him. A lot of times, the paper's readers would write furious letters or even send hate mail about what Derek had written. But Derek was really not bothered by that at all. In some ways, that was his aim, to get people all riled up. And he was sure that the article he was writing right now was going to be even more divisive than really anything else he had written. For Derek, though, really for him, it was all about individual freedoms and encouraging people to say no to government overreach in their daily lives. I mean, that really was sort of his general stance on every single choice and the right to decide what was best for one's body, and he was against it. Now, to be clear, the stakes for this issue were life and death. I mean, literally. But Derek believed that the fundamental freedom of being an American was the right to make your own decisions, even if it meant risking your own personal safety. And so as Derek sort of furiously typed away, he was encouraging everyone, like senators and politicians, everybody, to have the same kind of intensity that he had about this issue, to be just fully bought in on this idea of, as Americans, we need individual freedom. And then finally, when he was all done typing, Derek sat back and proofread the whole thing, and when he got to the last line, he got chills. It said, quote, "I just wish we could keep the government out of our pocketbooks and out of our personal decisions." Derek loved that line, and so he nodded, satisfied with his work. He had nailed it. Then he emailed his draft to his editor with a big smile on his face. Derek's article went to print just a few days later, on September 17th. And like most of Derek's other articles, this one for sure got a lot of angry emails and letters from people who disagreed with what Derek had to say. But all the vitriol in these messages just proved to Derek that his article had clearly been a success. He had sparked outrage and got people talking about this issue. Derek even hoped that maybe some of the readers got angry enough to actually take action. That's what he wanted. He wanted his writing to genuinely inspire. The rest of Derek's semester was a total blur. He kept writing his weekly column on top of all of his other obligations and exams and everything else, and before he knew it, the semester was over, and he was headed to his mother's house in Texas for Christmas break. A few weeks later, on January 4th, 2005, at 3 a.m., Derek rode in the back seat of a Ford Explorer SUV on his way back to school after the break. He'd caught a ride from his mother's home in Texas with two of his fraternity brothers who were sitting up front. And Derek had spent the first part of this just awful 13-hour-long drive doing what he did best, using his sarcasm to make his friends laugh, and he was also engaging them in really animated conversations. And so, the first 6 to 8 hours had sort of flown by. But now, it's basically the middle of the night still, / very early morning, and everybody had just gone quiet because they were all exhausted from this truly awful, long drive. All any of them wanted to do at this point was just get back to campus and be done. And eventually, Derek and his friends were very close to campus. They were finally in Nebraska, and they were driving down Interstate 80, which was a snowy, cold highway not far from the school. And Derek was really excited to start the new semester. He'd had a nice, laid-back holiday where he'd caught up on sleep and spent a lot of time just kind of hanging out and seeing his younger siblings. But Derek just was not the kind of person who liked slowing down for very long. And so he was quite eager to get back to his busy life on campus. Especially, he really wanted to get back to his column. He had had a lot of downtime and was able to brainstorm and come up with some good potential new topics for the column, but he really wasn't sure if any of those ideas were going to top the very controversial article that he had published back in September. People were still talking about that one. And Derek was still thinking about it too. In fact, his own words and advice to his readers were still ringing in his ears and guiding his everyday decisions. But for now, Derek just leaned his head up against the cold glass window of the car and waited for this long trip to finally be over. But suddenly, he felt the SUV lurch. And before he knew what was happening, he heard a deafening bang and he heard his friends screaming. Just minutes later, a police officer was flying down Interstate 80 in his cruiser. Eventually, he spotted a group of ambulances parked on the side of the road, and he knew that's where he needed to go, so he pulled over to the side and stopped. And when he got out, he saw in a ditch just off the highway was an overturned SUV. The officer immediately jumped out of his cruiser and rushed towards the vehicle. And when he got there, he found the scene was just absolutely chaotic. There were a team of paramedics who were at the window of the SUV trying to assess the condition of the victims inside and to get them out. And when the officer kneeled down to look inside as well, he could clearly see two people inside the vehicle. Now, both of them seemed basically fine beyond, obviously being in a wreck. I mean, they were banged up and clearly dazed, but their injuries didn't look immediately life-threatening. So, sort of relieved, the officer backed away to let the paramedics do their thing. But very quickly, the officer noticed that more paramedics were actually running past the SUV to something on the ground a few feet beyond it. And so the officer followed them to go see what it was they were running to. And when he saw what was on the ground, the officer just kind of stopped and knew instinctively that there was nothing anybody could do. I mean, there was a body of a young man on the ground who clearly was a third passenger of this SUV, but their body was just mangled almost beyond recognition. It would turn out Derek had been right. His September 17th, highly contentious column in the Daily Nebraskan would be his most controversial and famous piece ever. And actually, people are still talking about it today. Because his column was about how, we, all us Americans, reserve the right to make our own choices about our bodies and personal safety. And Derek believed that there was a law that was actually directly infringing on that right, which was the law that was forcing people to wear a seatbelt. Derek despised this requirement. He thought seatbelts should be just a personal decision about safety. To him, it was not just about buckling up, it was about individual choice, about freedom. And on January 4th, that SUV that Derek was riding in going back to school, well, the driver hit some ice on the road and lost control. The driver and the other passenger in the front were wearing seatbelts. But Derek, in keeping with his beliefs, was not. And so when the SUV crashed and flipped over, Derek alone was killed. As one reporter pointed out, Derek lived by his beliefs, and he also died by them. Our second and final story today is called The Resort. Just before 9 p.m. on Friday, January 13th, 2012, 51-year-old Francesco Scatino and his girlfriend, Dominica, sat at a table in a crowded restaurant at a resort in Italy. And they'd been there for a while, having a leisurely meal. So their table was covered with empty dishes, a wine decanter, and plates with the remnants of their amazing food. Now, having an extended, indulgent dinner like this one was not technically allowed, since Francesco was actually working. But Francesco was not too worried about breaking what he considered to be a small rule, because he was not just some hired hand. I mean, he was in charge of this entire resort on Italy's Tuscan coast. And the resort was amazing. It was literally right out on the water and had thousands of guest rooms and 6 restaurants with over a dozen bars, a theater, multiple swimming pools, and there was even a casino. So it had really a huge capacity for guests. And right now, there were easily more than 3,000 people staying at this resort. And Francesco was, very proud to be the boss of this place, this unbelievable place. He actually had started working at this resort as a security guard, but he'd worked his way up to the very top. And now he'd been overseeing this property for about 6 years. And being a leader really worked well for his personality, because he loved being impressive and feeling important. He'd heard staff and former coworkers complain about how he was too over the top and a bit of a show-off, so he had heard those things. But Francesco knew that really these people, they were just jealous. He was handsome, he had a great job, and he had two just beautiful, amazing women in his life when, some people didn't have any. And so now Francesco smiled at one of his girlfriends, Dominica, who sat across the table from him and enjoying the dessert they were sharing. Francesco was married, but recently, Dominica had become the most important woman in his life. She was a dancer, and to him, she was just perfect. They'd only met a few weeks ago, so they were still in the honeymoon phase, where they were both still very flirtatious and eager to impress one another. And so right now, Francesco knew he should leave and get back to his managing duties, but he was having so much fun with Dominica, so he lingered, eating his dessert as slowly as he could. But as he sat there, slow playing his dessert, he realized, their night together didn't actually have to end just because the dinner was over. There was something he could do right now that would give them maybe another hour or so together. And it would also completely blow Dominica away and prove to her just how amazing he really was. So suddenly, with a big smile on his face, he told Dominica to hurry up, finish eating, because they needed to get upstairs immediately. A few minutes later, Francesco and Dominica hurried into the resort's top floor operations center. And just like the entire rest of the place, this room, despite being an operations center, was still just massively impressive. In addition to all the very new age, high-speed monitors and security feeds and maps all over the room, there was this huge window that overlooked this balcony, this exterior balcony, that looked down on the ocean. It was like this beautiful view of the ocean, and it even overlooked a stretch of small seaside villages called Giglio. This room was also filled with all of Francesco's employees hustling around and, staring at screens and talking on headsets. But as soon as Francesco and Dominica walked in there, Francesco kind of went to the center of the room and kind of got everybody's attention and told them all to listen up. Then he went over the details of his big idea. The resort was going to put on a very specific and spectacular kind of show called a salute. And they were going to do it right now. So salutes were very popular in this area of Italy. And Francesco's resort actually did them all the time. So this was not totally unusual. They were basically kind of a performance, mostly for the locals, where the resort would flash all of its lights and play music, while guests of the resort would go to their balconies and wave and cheer to the residents and the other tourists in Giglio. But critically, salutes needed to be both quick and highly choreographed. That's really the only way they worked. And so in order for a salute to work, it really required the attention and active participation from a large number of people. This was a big to-do. And so given the fact that these were sort of a big endeavor, it meant that, something could go wrong if you're not really careful. And Francesco actually had a mentor who'd actively discouraged him to not do these salutes or try to do as few as you can because of the fact that things could go wrong. But Francesco's mentor was not physically here right now to tell Francesco to stop. And the people that were here were pretty excited about his idea. So Francesco began going over the plan with his staff. And as he expected, with such a complicated undertaking, there were a lot of logistics to look over. However, when Francesco actually started going about these preparations, he realized he couldn't actually read anything because he didn't have his glasses on. He didn't think he looked handsome with them on, so he hadn't brought them out to dinner with Dominica, but now he really needed them. But thinking on his feet, Francesco simply asked a staff member to read him whatever information he really needed to know in order to do this salute. And so the staff member did as they were told, and at the end of it, Francesco felt like he had heard what he needed to hear and he thought everything was in order, and so he nodded and said, "Okay, we are all set to begin." And then he looked over at Dominica and smiled and sort of nodded like, "Okay, here we go." Then she knew whatever was coming next was going to be really, really special. When Francesco gave the actual order to begin the salute, everybody in the operations room jumped into action. And as soon as the actual salute began, Francesco squinted out the huge window that looked out over the ocean and Giglio down below, and Francesco was just so excited when he thought about how everyone who was out and about in town would look up and see his palace all lit up and full of life and energy. But as he peered at the lights of Giglio, he realized something wasn't quite right. Even without his glasses on, he could see that there was something outside in the darkness, just barely illuminated by the town's lights. It was a large shape right between the resort and Giglio. And to his horror, Francesco realized it was actually getting closer, fast. At the same time, but on the other side of the resort, an American man named Brian Aho was eating dinner with his wife and teenage daughter at the Milano restaurant, which was one of 6 restaurants in the resort. And they'd just been enjoying their meal when there was this deafening banging sound, and the entire room gave a huge jolt and everything inside just sort of went flying. Brian grabbed the table to brace himself as plates and glasses shot off the table and shattered everywhere. And then he heard screams and people hitting the ground all around him as diners were literally being thrown from their chairs. And then there was another series of crashes when some ceiling panels fell from above and smashed onto the ground. But then it was over. The shaking abruptly stopped, and Brian immediately jumped up to make sure that his wife and daughter were okay, and they did seem fine, just dazed like everybody else in the room. As Brian stood up, he could tell he was, mostly okay, also shaken up. But the overwhelming thought was just having no idea what had just happened. I mean, he's looking around and no one seemed to know. It had felt like some kind of earthquake or something. But then Brian thought, if this had been an earthquake, he really had to get his family out of this restaurant immediately in case of aftershocks. But it seemed like all the other diners clearly had the same idea, because before Brian could actually move, there was a surge of activity around him as dozens of people just began rushing towards the exit of the restaurant. And Brian didn't want him or his family to get caught in the middle of this huge crowd. Huge amounts of people running in the exact same direction, a panicked group of people, could easily create a stampede. And he was worried that he and his family could get pulled to the ground and trampled in the chaos. So he looked around and he saw on the other side of the restaurant there was a smaller door that nobody else was going to. So he and his family began making their way over to it. But before they could actually get through this door, the overhead lights began to flicker and then went out. And then with the darkness, suddenly came the blast of emergency alarms echoing through the resort. And then he could hear more screams, not just inside of this restaurant, but sort of all over the place. It was like the resort had devolved into madness. Brian had never been more scared in his whole life. I mean, his pulse was racing faster than he thought was even possible, and he almost felt paralyzed, like this was just too much to even process. He also, like basically everybody else, had no clue what was going on here. But I mean, navigating his family through an emergency was already going to be horrifying and terrifying and dangerous. But now he would also have to do it in the dark. For a moment, Brian and his family just stood there, kind of frozen in the dark. And then Brian was about to tell his family to just go through the door, we'll figure it out in the dark. But then luckily, the emergency lights came on, giving the room sort of a dim, eerie glow. But it was enough to sort of guide their way. And so at that point, Brian didn't wait. He grabbed his wife and his daughter, pushed through the side door, and headed out into the hallway. It would take nearly 10 minutes for Brian and his family to navigate the maze of hallways they had just walked into until finally they stepped outside and were in the open air. But when they finally got out there, Brian realized they actually had a really big problem, because the exit they had just taken had taken them not to safety. It had led them to this expansive outdoor terrace with a railing on the 4th floor of the resort, which meant they still needed to get down multiple levels in order to, evacuate safely. But just the fact they were on the 4th floor was not the big issue. The big issue was the terrace was clearly packed with other people from the resort who were also trying to evacuate. There was all these people basically blocking their way. So basically, everybody who has no idea what's going on is just like pushing and shoving each other, and there were no authority figures or any staff around to actually direct what now was basically an evacuation. And Brian could tell that the crowd was clearly starting to panic, and really he was too. Everybody was just like, what's happening here? And so Brian was about to suggest to his family that they try to find another way out when they heard the crackling of the resort's public speaker system, and a voice came on that finally delivered some information about what was happening. It said that there had been an electrical blackout, but everything was fine, and technicians were hard at work trying to fix the problem. So in the meantime, all the guests should stay calm and just go to their rooms for safety. And at this point, it was very obvious that the mood all around Brian and his family completely changed. People stopped pushing and arguing and panicking, and Brian himself felt that knot of dread in his stomach sort of loosen a bit. I mean, an electrical blackout didn't seem like a life or death situation, so he, and clearly everybody else, felt a whole lot less scared. Pretty much right away, many of the guests began heading back inside, making their way to their rooms. And Brian actually spotted a few staff members who were in the crowd, encouraging people to do just that, go back to your rooms. And so for a few moments, Brian and his family and the others just kind of stayed put and just kind of let things play out, kind of watching things settle back into normal. But then it was like with no warning, there was this other huge banging sound, and the floor once again buckled under Brian's feet. And this triggered a whole new wave of just absolute chaos out on this terrace. All at once, everybody started shouting and pushing each other in pure panic. And at the same time, there were all these new announcements coming out frantically over the loudspeaker, but it wasn't doing anything. It was like the crowd had decided something bad is happening and no one can tell me otherwise. I have to leave. Everybody is just trying to evacuate all at once. And so pretty much right at this point, you had a group of people who were out on the terrace who decided to charge into the resort to try to find another way to evacuate. And also you had the group of people who had already gone back inside to go back to their rooms, who had changed their mind, who charged right back out, back onto the terrace. And so for a moment, it was like these two pools of people kind of smashing into each other. And Brian and his family were kind of off to the side because they had just barely stepped out onto the terrace when all of this stuff was happening. But then Brian watched in complete shock as he saw some of the people, after they pushed through all the way to the edge of the terrace to the railing, they began climbing over the railing to climb down from the 4th floor. Seeing this was horrifying for Brian, but then he felt yet another shudder under his feet and a loud industrial groaning sound from the resort right behind him. And he knew if he didn't do what these people were doing, he and his family might not be able to evacuate. Clearly, there was a real problem. They didn't know what it was, but they had to go. So he grabbed his wife and his daughter's hands, he shoved his way through the crowd to the railing, over the railing they went, and down they began to climb. Meanwhile, back up in the top-level operations center, Francesco was staring out the room's huge window, just completely frozen in shock. His resort was in complete pandemonium. Below, guests were running, others were fighting and shoving, and some were literally leaping to their potential deaths from the upper-level balconies and terraces. And so as Francesco watched all of this carnage, he tried to wrap his head around how the night had gone so horrifically wrong. The worst part of all of it was there was absolutely no way to fix it. He'd been trying to show Dominica and everybody else how amazing and impressive and in control he was, but he'd completely lost control of this whole situation. And he'd also lost his girlfriend because Dominica had quickly fled the resort. And then there was a loud crashing sound somewhere in the distance, and his heart pounded and he realized it was time for him to start running too. Minutes later, Francesco and some of his staff sprinted through the halls of the resort. And as they ran, thunderous noises and bangs came from every direction, and debris from the ceiling and walls crashed to the ground all around them as they were shaken loose. And all the while, over the noise, Francesco could hear the continuous shrieks of panic from people who were still clearly trapped inside the resort and just couldn't get out. But he and the others he was with finally did make it to the exit. And this exit was not overrun with panicking people. So Francesco was lucky enough to be able to pretty quickly make it to the bottom level and then keep on going. And he did not look back, not until he was far away and definitely to safety. But when he did finally stop running, and he did turn around and looked back at his resort, his stomach pitched so hard he nearly vomited. Because finally, he could see right in front of him the full, horrible extent of what he had done. It would turn out what Francesco was looking at was the culmination of a record number of terrible choices he had made that night. 1. Francesco would later deny this, but he was seen drinking alcohol at dinner while he was supposed to be working. 2. he was not wearing his glasses, which meant he was his most handsome self, but also that he couldn't see very well. And 3, he was distracted by his new girlfriend, who he had brought to an area where only key personnel were allowed because he was desperate to impress her. Now, in most workplaces, this would all just be considered unprofessional and maybe might get you fired. But in Francesco's workplace, it was much worse than that. What he had done was incredibly dangerous because the resort that Francesco managed was not a regular hotel. It was a gigantic cruise ship called the Costa Concordia. Francesco was its captain, and when he issued the order for the boat to do a salute, he was not just ordering a complicated but entertaining show. A cruise ship salute also involves steering the massive boat much closer to shore than usual to appropriately show off to the locals on land. But because Francesco literally couldn't see very well, was obviously distracted and possibly drunk, he didn't notice that when they did this salute, they were going way too fast and way too close to shore. That shape he saw rushing towards them in the darkness was an enormous cluster of rocks. By the time he saw it, it was too late. The Concordia had smashed into the rocks, tearing a 230-foot wide hole in the hull, which immediately flooded the ship. And then making matters even worse, Francesco delayed rescue efforts for more than an hour by trying to convince people that what had happened was just an electrical outage. And then when he finally did issue an evacuation order, he broke a sacred rule for ship captains. He fled the boat before the remainder of his crew and the passengers. Like he was the first one off. He did not go down with his ship. That American passenger, Brian Aho, and his family would survive, because after they decided to go over the railing, they, perilously climbed down 4 levels all the way to a lifeboat, and so they survived. But unfortunately, 32 other people who were on board the boat ultimately died, all because of Francesco's desire to show off. Francesco himself was ultimately arrested for manslaughter and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. He was subsequently named Italy's most hated man. The Mr. Ballen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio, Perry Kroll, and Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the Mr. Ballen podcast, you can also now watch on the Mr. Ballen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 2 stories about people who went to disturbing lengths to carry out their plans. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Last Tenant, and it's about a man who is very stubborn all the way until the very end. And the second and final story you'll hear is called The Good Reverend, and it's about a reverend and a vagabond who are involved in a wild mystery. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to clean the Follow Button's house. But instead of cleaning it, just go ahead and bring in a whole wrecking crew to level their property. Okay, this was massive. It took up an entire block, and it was comprised of several two-story buildings. When David moved in 8 years earlier, this apartment complex was sort of bustling and doing quite well. There were loads of tenants, it was well kept, it was a nice place to live. But now, the place was kind of fallen into disrepair. There were weeds everywhere, it was kind of dirty, there was graffiti, buildings were all boarded up. This place really had fallen on hard times, almost like it was abandoned. And in many regards, it basically was. In fact, David was literally the last tenant in the entire complex. There were a total of 72 apartments in this complex, but 71 of them were boarded up and totally abandoned. It was just this last apartment that David lived in. And on this day, as David approached his front door, he noticed there was something taped to it. It was a piece of paper. And so he walked up and he read it, and he quickly understood it was an eviction notice. They were kicking him out. And so he angrily ripped it off the door and he went inside his cramped, small apartment. There's a full-size billiard table sitting right in his living room, and everything was just tight and on top of each other, but this was David's home. He loved it here. He did not want to leave. And so he took this eviction notice and he went over to the kitchen and he just threw it on top of a pile of other papers that were mostly all from the company that owned this complex. The company was called Atlantic Housing. So part of the reason this building had really fallen on hard times here is because 2 years earlier, Atlantic Housing had decided to tear this place down. And so they had offered to help relocate all the tenants, and basically everybody else had agreed to leave and, take the assistance from Atlantic Housing, but not David. He refused to leave. And so eventually, Atlantic Housing got fed up with David because they're offering him money, they're offering him assistance. They're really trying to just get him to leave so they can move forward with their project. And so eventually, when he wouldn't budge, no matter what they offered him, they just sued him. And it took 2 years, but eventually a court ruled that, okay, Atlantic Housing, you can kick him out of your building. And so David, you're being evicted. And so David knew this was coming. He knew he was going to be evicted, but he just simply could not accept the ruling. He's looking around at his cramped little apartment that he had called home for 8 years. He just loved it here. He didn't want to leave. And so he thought to himself, you know what? They can try to evict me, but I'm not leaving. And so David decides he's going to protest, but not some little protest. He's going to do something that is so big, so extreme, that it will guarantee people will pay attention and recognize that this ruling is wrong. And David knew exactly how he was going to do that. And so later that afternoon, David made his way over to his storage closet and he pulled out some rope, an electric timer, and a power tool, and he brought these supplies over to his living room. And there, David rigged up this elaborate trap that he was designing specifically so that when Atlantic Housing or the police or whoever it was that showed up to evict him, that when they opened his door, they would have to be confronted by this trap. And for David, he felt like this was his last-ditch effort to prove once and for all that this eviction was wrong. A few hours later, 2 police officers, along with David's very worried parents, stood outside of David's apartment. Earlier that afternoon, David's parents had tried to get in touch with David and they had called him repeatedly, but he hadn't answered. And so at some point, they had driven over to his apartment and they had pounded on the door and tried to get his attention, but he hadn't come to the door. However, they had heard this strange sound coming from inside the apartment. And it was unsettling enough, and considering the whole circumstance of not being able to get in touch with their son, that they decided to call the police. And so when they got there, the police, they're knocking on the door, yelling out for David, but still no answer. And the police too, they can clearly hear this strange sound, which almost sounded like a mechanical whirring sound or something. They couldn't quite place it, but there definitely was something odd happening in this apartment. And so given the fact that, there's real concern around what's going on with David, the police decide to kick in the door and see what's going on. And so they get out of the way, and one of the officers steps back and kicks the door down, and as soon as the door flies open, that loud mechanical whirring sound becomes way louder. It's so loud, and they suddenly get a complete view into the apartment, and all of them just froze and gasped. So the trap that David had built had functioned exactly as he intended it to. Basically, the authorities were going to come in the front door and be horrified by what they saw. Because this trap really was not for them as much as it was for David. He was sort of putting himself into a trap as a display of his protest that you can't pull me out of here. And now authorities have arrived and they've seen the results of this trap. What the trap was a power tool that was on, that was the mechanical whirring sound they heard, and it had been tied by David to one of the legs of his billiard table, like an arm jutting off the side of this billiard table. And then the tool had this electric timer that he had rigged to it so that when it went off, it would start the tool. And what was this tool? It was a chainsaw. And what did David do? He intentionally positioned his neck right up against the teeth of this chainsaw, set the timer, and then waited. And he basically timed it so that shortly after getting in position, the timer would go off, it would cut his head off, and then presumably authorities would look inside the apartment and see what, in David's mind, they were responsible for, his death. And sure enough, when the police and the parents looked in, they saw the trap, they heard the saw buzzing, and they saw David's severed head on the ground. Despite David's final protest really having a lot of the effect that he was hoping for, I mean, it did make headlines all over the UK. A lot of people heard about this and they were horrified by it. Despite all that, shortly after his death, the apartment complex was demolished. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Good Reverend. On the afternoon of January 5th, 1909, a 56-year-old reverend named John Carmichael kissed his wife and kids goodbye and then stepped out of his cottage into the cold and wrapped his cloak around his black suit, and then he hopped on his horse and he galloped out onto the road. Reverend Carmichael lived in a rural part of Michigan, and on this day, he was making his way to another town about 9 miles away called Columbus, where he was going to host this big religious revival. Basically, he was going to hold this big sermon and try to get new people to join his church. And so as the Reverend galloped his way down the road, he saw all these kids outside having snowball fights and making snowmen, and it was just really nice. But also, in virtue of being the Reverend, basically everybody in town knew him, and so either the kids wanted to say hi to him or their parents did. And so as the Reverend is really just trying to hustle his way to Columbus, he kept having to stop over and over again to have small talk and play nice. But after about 30 minutes, he had reached a point in the journey where all the houses were kind of behind him, and he had this kind of nice quiet stretch where he knew he wouldn't be bothered by anybody. He had made this journey many times to Columbus, and he always looked forward to this stretch of the road. It was just very peaceful and gave him a chance to kind of just be left with his own thoughts and think about his upcoming sermon and what he wanted to say. And so as the Reverend was having this sort of peaceful time trotting his way down the snowy road, he heard the sound of hooves fast approaching him. And so the Reverend turned around and he saw there was this very rough-looking guy wearing this brown stained shirt with a long overcoat over it. And the guy's hair was slicked back and greasy, and he had this big weird grin on his face, and he was waving wildly at the Reverend, obviously trying to flag him down. Now, inside, the Reverend did not want to talk to this guy, because he knew who this guy was. His name was Gideon Browning, and he lived in the town where the Reverend lived, and he was known for being kind of erratic and had a horrible drinking problem. And frankly, the Reverend just wanted to be left alone. Here he was enjoying his ride, and here comes the town drunk. He doesn't want to be around this guy. But also the Reverend understood that he was the Reverend in town. People knew who he was. He couldn't just be a jerk to people. He had to be kind. And so he smiled at Gideon and waved to him to be polite, but was dreading this interaction with Gideon. And in fact, weirdly enough, the Reverend over the past several weeks had been running into Gideon all over town, to the point where it was becoming weird that he just kept seeing Gideon. And every time he interacted with Gideon, it was just awful, because Gideon was just totally an unpleasant person. But here he was, once again, having to have yet another interaction with Gideon. And as soon as Gideon came right up alongside the Reverend, his first question was, "Hey, Reverend, can I ride with you?" And the Reverend, again, is like, "My goodness, I don't want to do this right now." But he was like, "Of course we can ride together." And pretty much immediately, the Reverend regretted this decision, because Gideon would just not shut up. He just talked the entire time they were supposed to be in this peaceful part of the Reverend's journey. But not only that, the questions Gideon was asking Reverend the whole time they were riding together were sort of invasive. Gideon wanted to know exactly where the Reverend was going and what he was doing there, and, how many churches did the Reverend own, and just all these personal questions. And sort of against his better judgment, the Reverend was being truthful with Gideon. He told Gideon that he was going to Columbus to have this big revival, and he also told Gideon about one of the churches that he owned in a town called Rattle Run. And as the Reverend was again kind of giving up this information that he kind of wished he wasn't, he noticed Gideon began doing something strange. As Gideon was galloping along, keeping a fixed gaze on the Reverend, Gideon reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver coin and began flipping the coin into the air and catching it and flipping it and catching it over and over and over again, never affecting his riding. I mean, it was like Gideon wasn't even aware he was flicking this coin. And the Reverend, he's kind of watching Gideon do this, and it was sort of impressive. Like Gideon was just able to flick this coin over and over and never drop it and just keep on stride. But more than just being impressed with Gideon's hand-eye coordination, the Reverend began to notice that he really liked what Gideon was doing with this coin. It was kind of soothing in a way. Not so much the actual coin flipping in the air, but the sound it was making. The sound of it spinning in the air and slapping into his palm over and over again. It just kind of put the Reverend at ease, and he didn't know why. And so after a while, the Reverend just kind of stopped answering Gideon's questions and just kind of stared at the coin and listened to that sound. And he just felt himself drift into this weird, relaxed state, almost like he felt asleep. And so as this weird thing is going on with this coin, the two men eventually reach this crossroads where there's a general store, and at this point Gideon catches his coin, puts it back in his pocket, and the two men, they come to a stop at this general store, even though the Reverend did not want to go to this general store. He just kind of followed Gideon up to the hitching post. They both got off their horses, they tied their horses to the post, and again the Reverend's thinking, I can't stop here, I gotta go to Columbus, I gotta get to this revival. But Gideon just turns to the Reverend and says, hey, we gotta make a stop here, we need to get something. And the Reverend found himself saying, okay, what are we going to get? And the Reverend's thinking, what am I saying? I don't want to do this. I don't want to stop here. I got to go. But he just stood there, just waiting for Gideon to tell him what they were going to buy. And Gideon, who had that big grin on his face again, he said, well, actually, I'm not going to go into the store. You are. You're going to go in there. You're going to buy me a new hatchet and you're going to bring it out here and give it to me. And now everything about this was totally weird to the Reverend. He did not feel like this was a normal request, nor did he want to go in the store. He wanted to leave. But for some reason, he just said, okay. And he turned and shuffled in the store, found a new hatchet, paid for it with his own money, walked outside, handed it over to Gideon. And then at this point, the Reverend just wanted to get on his horse and get away from Gideon. But the second the Reverend got back on his horse to do that, Gideon hopped on his horse and said, hold on a minute, Reverend. We're not done yet. Now we're going to go to your church and Rattle Run, because I'm getting married soon and I'm thinking about maybe getting married in your church and I want to scope it out. And so the Reverend at this, who again just wants to go to Columbus, he doesn't want to be around Gideon at all, but for some reason he just said, okay, yeah, we'll go to my church and Rattle Run. And so at this point, Gideon pulled out his coin and started flipping it again and again, and the two men rode side by side in the direction of Rattle Run. And the whole time, the Reverend's thinking, what am I doing? Why are we doing this? And also, in addition to just brain fog and confusion, the Reverend also realized that Gideon was clearly lying to him because he knew Gideon was married. So what's he talking about needing to scope out his church to see about potentially getting married there? That didn't make sense. Like, why was Gideon actually wanting to go to his church? The Reverend didn't know, but he was really starting to feel scared. But again, he just couldn't stop agreeing to the things Gideon wanted to do. And so the two men galloped their way to Rattle Run. The whole time Gideon's flipping that coin and staring at the Reverend, and the Reverend's just totally transfixed on the coin. And then they get to the church. Gideon puts the coin in his pocket. The two men hitch their horses to the post outside. They go up to the front door. The Reverend unlocks it. They go inside. And sort of automatically, the Reverend walked to the back of the church and he lit the stove. And then as he was walking back towards the front, where Gideon was still standing right in front of the doorway, Gideon suddenly told the Reverend to stop where he was. And so the Reverend stopped in the middle of the church and he's just looking at Gideon, who's got that coin back out, and he's flipping it up and down again. And at this point, the Reverend just looks at Gideon and says, well, do you want to look around? And Gideon, who's flipping that coin up and down, just says, no, I don't need to look around. There is no wedding. Hey, Reverend, go ahead and lift up your left arm. And at this point, the Reverend is terrified, he's confused, and his left arm just suddenly raised up into the air. He had no control over it. And then a second later, Gideon says, hey, go ahead and raise your other arm. And so the Reverend, who's still got his left arm out to one side, felt his right arm come up to the other side. And so at this point, the Reverend's just standing there with his arms out to the side, and it was at this point that the Reverend understood what was going on. Clearly, Gideon had hypnotized him. That could be the only explanation for what was going on here. But before the Reverend could say or do anything about how totally weird the situation was, Gideon, who was flipping that coin and had a big grin on his face the whole time he was making the Reverend raise his arms up, suddenly Gideon's face completely changed, and he became deadly serious, and he was staring at the Reverend, and then he dropped the coin to the ground and began moving towards the Reverend. The following day, around noon, the caretaker for Reverend Carmichael's Rattle Run Church made his way to that church to check in on the building. He knew Reverend Carmichael was going to be in Columbus for a few days, and so he just wanted to make sure, nothing was out of the ordinary. And as this caretaker galloped up to this small white steepled church, he noticed right away there was a column of smoke coming up out of the chimney. Clearly there was a fire lit inside of the church, and the caretaker's thinking, that doesn't make any sense. The Reverend is not supposed to be here, so who could possibly be in the church right now? And then after the caretaker got up to the front door, he was about to put his key in the lock when he discovered the door was already unlocked. And so instinctively, he put his hand on his pistol on his hip, and then he grabbed the handle and he flung the door open, and when he looked inside the church, he just froze. Because the entire interior of the church was drenched in blood. There was blood on the pews, the walls, on the altar, and then also amongst all this blood, the caretaker also noticed there were little pieces of ripped up fabric all over the place, and he saw one of them had a unique button sewn into it, a button he recognized as belonging on Reverend Carmichael's suit. And so the caretaker is horrified. He's looking around. He doesn't see anybody, but he sees there's a drag trail right down the center aisle all the way up to the altar, and it curves around to the right out of view. Now, the caretaker wanted to turn and run away, but he was worried that maybe Reverend Carmichael was in here somewhere and was maybe still alive and he could help him. And so the caretaker felt like it was his responsibility to investigate. And so he drew his pistol and he began walking down this bloody aisle, kind of looking around for any sign of anybody inside the church, but it was deadly silent. And he eventually got about halfway down the aisle when he spotted a silver coin sitting in the middle of the aisle covered in blood. And he kept on walking to where the blood trail turned around the pew, and it led right up to that stove that was obviously still smoldering, and the door to the stove was shut. So the caretaker couldn't see what was inside of it. And so the caretaker just walked up to the stove, and after looking around one more time to make sure nobody else was in here, he opened up the stove, and inside the stove was a human skull. News of Reverend Carmichael's horrific murder very quickly spread all around town and beyond just that town. I mean, this was all over the place. And within 24 hours, there was this huge police investigation that was launched to try to figure out who killed him. And very quickly, the police in Rattle Run spoke to the sheriff of the town where the Reverend lived, and they learned that on the same day that Reverend Carmichael had left to go to Columbus and then obviously was killed inside of his church, well, on that same day, a man named Gideon Browning had this really big blow-up public fight in town, same town as Reverend Carmichael, with his brother-in-law. And this fight was so explosive, lots of people saw it and heard it, and people said after this big fight with his brother-in-law, Gideon had hopped on his horse and rode off angrily. And the kids in that town who were outside that day having snowball fights and building snowmen, they would say that they saw Reverend Carmichael traveling down this road because he talked to all the kids and their parents. And not long after Reverend Carmichael had kind of disappeared down the road, they also reported seeing Gideon Browning coming down the same road, heading in the same direction as Reverend Carmichael. And after that, nobody had seen Gideon since. And so very quickly, Gideon became the #1 suspect in this murder. And basically the thought was, Gideon was so angry from this fight with his brother-in-law that he must have just taken out his anger on the Reverend. Basically, the Reverend was in the wrong place at the wrong time and got killed. Now, the police knew this was a flimsy theory at best, but Gideon had a reputation for being totally erratic and a total drunk, and so it kind of fit with who he was, that this was something maybe he would do. And so within 24 hours of the murder, there was this huge multi-statewide manhunt for Gideon. 3 days later, and 500 miles away from the town of Rattle Run, in a city in Illinois, a man opened the door to a boarding house and stepped inside. And the owner of the boarding house, her name was Miranda Hughes, she was sitting behind the front desk, and when she looked up and saw this man, she had to stifle a gasp, because this man looked absolutely horrible. He was wearing this really dark stained brown shirt with a long overcoat over it, and he was shivering and skinny and pale and just looked like he was about to die, basically. But the man just walked up to her and said his name was John Elder, and he wanted to rent a room. Now, Miranda, for a second, thought about refusing this guy's service, just because, honestly, he kind of frightened her. But then again, Miranda thought, you know what? A lot of my guests are pretty rough these days, and this guy's got money and he wants a room, so there you go, I'll give him a room. So she brought him upstairs to a room on the second floor. She opened it up, John stepped inside, and Miranda, as a courtesy, said, hey, do you want me to make you some food? And John, without even turning around, just says, no, I'm fasting, and then he shut the door in her face. For the rest of the weekend, despite what John told Miranda, Miranda would come up to his room and leave food outside of his door at every mealtime. It was something she did for her guests. But John never came out to get the food, and for a little while, Miranda was actually kind of concerned about this guy, considering how terrible he looked, and now he's fasting. That didn't seem healthy. But at the same time, Miranda was kind of happy to not have to deal with this guy, and so she basically ignored him. But on the morning of January 12th, so 1 week after the murder and 3 days after John Elder had checked into this boarding house, Miranda was walking across the back lawn of this boarding house when she heard what sounded like somebody moaning in pain coming from the outhouse. Now, normally, Miranda would never even think of going to the outhouse and seeing if somebody was okay in there, but the sound this person was making sounded so obviously like they were in pain that she just couldn't help herself. And so Miranda ran to the door of this outhouse and she yelled inside, "Hey, are you okay in there?" And the only sound she heard coming out was more moaning and whimpering. And so acting on a gut instinct, Miranda grabbed the door and flung it open, and what she saw made her scream. It was John Elder, and he was sitting on the toilet looking up at her with wide, panicked eyes, and his throat had been slashed from ear to ear. She could basically see deep into his neck. This was a fatal wound, and he was bleeding everywhere. And so Miranda stumbled backwards, turned around, and ran to go find police. By the time the police arrived at the boarding house and went to the outhouse, John Elder was already dead from this horrible wound. And at first, the police did not connect the death of John Elder to what had happened in Rattle Run 500 miles away. They were totally disconnected. That is, until police searched John Elder, and they found in one of his pockets was a blood-stained letter addressed to the sheriff of Rattle Run. And as soon as the police read it, they knew they had something huge on their hands, because John Elder was not who he said he was. To understand who John Elder was, and to even begin to understand what happened in Rattle Run, we need to go back to January 6th, the day that Reverend Carmichael left his house and began making the journey to Columbus for this big revival. During that journey, Reverend Carmichael did come in contact with Gideon Browning. Gideon Browning came up alongside him, they rode together, they went to that general store, and Reverend Carmichael did buy that hatchet for Gideon, and they did go to the Rattle Run Church. But the reason they did all these strange activities together is not because Gideon had hypnotized Reverend Carmichael. The actual reason for why they did these things together is even more bizarre. In the weeks leading up to that fateful day, January 6th, Reverend Carmichael was running into Gideon Browning all the time, all over town. It was like everywhere the Reverend went, there was Gideon. And then on January 6th, when the Reverend is making his way down the road and he turns and sees Gideon Browning coming up alongside him, he's like, "Oh my goodness, it's happening again." But the way the Reverend handled this was not to say, "Wow, what a strange coincidence. I keep running into this guy everywhere I go." Instead, the Reverend believed that Gideon must have some sort of special power, that he's able to know where I am at all times, and he's using that power to try to intimidate me by spying on me. And so on January 6th, when Gideon came galloping up alongside of the Reverend's already completely paranoid and on edge about Gideon, fearing this guy has magical powers, basically. And then when Gideon pulled out that coin and began flipping it into the air, which apparently was just something he did, the Reverend took that as, "Oh my goodness, in addition to having magical powers to always know where I am, Gideon also has the power of hypnosis. And that coin that I can't take my eyes off that sounds so incredible and it's soothing me, well, that is hypnotizing me. Gideon is now controlling me and my thoughts and my body." And so at this point, the Reverend actually believed he was hypnotized, and so he just kind of began going along with anything Gideon wanted. And so it's assumed that Gideon did want to stop at the general store and just kind of said, "Hey, do you want to stop at the general store?" And the Reverend's like, "Yes, I'll stop at the general store." And then maybe Gideon asked the Reverend, "Hey, do you mind buying me a new hatchet?" And the Reverend's like, "Yes, I'll buy you a new hatchet." And he goes in, gets the hatchet, comes back out. And then apparently, Gideon said, "Hey, I want to go check out your church in Rattle Run." And the Reverend was like, "Yeah, okay, let's go check it out." And then when they got to the church, at some point, the Reverend just went to the middle of the church and put his arms out to either side like he was Jesus Christ nailed to the cross, even though, Gideon had not made him do that. This is the Reverend, caught up in his own delusion. As he's standing there like this, Gideon, who's flipping the coin, fumbles it and it falls to the ground. And the Reverend, who believes that coin has full control over what he's doing, he thought, "Oh my gosh, the spell is now broken. I need to save myself." And so the Reverend ran and grabbed that hatchet, and he forced Gideon to take off all his clothes, and then he made Gideon hand the clothes over, and once the Reverend had those clothes, he hacked Gideon to pieces and then burned his body in that stove. And then after this horrific murder, the Reverend took his own suit and basically ripped it off and shredded it to bits and then kind of threw it all around the church to make it seem like he had been the one who was killed and that was his skull inside of the stove. And then he put on all of Gideon Browning's clothes, the brown dirty shirt and the long coat. And then he traveled 500 miles to Miranda Hughes's boarding house, where he went inside and booked a room under the pseudonym John Elder. And while the Reverend was hiding out inside of this boarding house, the police in Rattle Run very quickly figured out that the body inside of the church, the skull inside of the stove, and the remains that were in there did not belong to Reverend Carmichael. They belonged to Gideon Browning. And so immediately it went from, Gideon Browning must have done it, to no, Reverend Carmichael is the killer and he killed Gideon. But before they could track the Reverend down, Reverend Carmichael, aka John Elder, had gone into that outhouse and slit his own throat. However, when the police searched John Elder's body, so Reverend Carmichael's body, they would find that blood-stained letter addressed to the sheriff in Rattle Run, and basically it was a confession. Now, granted, it was the confession of Reverend Carmichael, who genuinely believed Gideon had hypnotized him and had all these special powers, and he basically was acting in self-defense, but nonetheless, it was still a confession to murder. Now, of course, there's lots of details in this story that we can't be totally sure of. Like, we don't really know what the discussions were like between Reverend Carmichael and Gideon Browning when they met on that road and then eventually made their way to the church and the murder happened. This is basically just the best theory around what happened. Also, it's worth noting that there was a history of mental illness in Reverend Carmichael's family, but this story happened at a time when nobody took mental health seriously,